What if the sky was never dark? What if, from the very birth of Earth, this planet had not grown beneath the singular flame of one star, but between the unblinking eyes of two? In such a dawn, the familiar rhythm of day turning into night would dissolve. There would be no true darkness, no deep velvet pause in the cycle of time as we know it, only a ceaseless glow drawn from double horizons. It is a thought both marvelous and unnerving. To imagine a world where shadow is uncertain, where every shape wears not one echo, but two. Under such skies, what would it mean to dream? Our inner clocks, so carefully tuned to the pulse of daylight and the hush of nightfall, are fragile things. Sleep, in many ways, is an evolutionary agreement with darkness, a slowing of the body while the world recedes. But if night never came, if two suns threaded the hours into one seamless tapestry of brightness, would we have learned to sleep differently? Perhaps slumber would become shorter, scattered in fragments like forgotten breaths caught between moments of brightness. Or maybe sleep itself would grow rare, replaced by a restless wakefulness painted endlessly by dual streams of light. The sky in this imagined world would not be familiar. You could look up and see not a single blazing disk but two, moving in slow rhythmic patterns, sometimes apart, sometimes drawing nearer. Sometimes one would soften the harshness of the other, casting the land in a doubled glow of overlapping halos. Sometimes both would burn, fierce and merciless, their combined fire washing coastlines in a relentless tide of energy. In such air, the very chemistry of the atmosphere might shift. More radiation filtering down, more heat pressing into seas, more storms brewing from currents stirred by light that never truly rests. Even the colors above would differ. Sunsets would not be brief dissolves of orange into blue, but long, layered paintings carved by two sources scattering across particles of dust and vapor. The sky itself would become a memory of those twin flames, never quite finished with its canvas. Geology tells us that Earth's great rhythms, the erosion of stone, the circling of the climate, the slow collapse of mountains into riverbeds, are shaped by light. Heat fuels rain, rain feeds rivers, rivers carve valleys, and valleys store sediment as pages in stone-bound books. With two suns, these processes would quicken. Perhaps mountains would fall away faster, cracked by wider swings of heat and cold, their fragments rushed into oceans that churn endlessly under greater evaporation. Sediments would thicken sooner, layers press tighter, and fossils would be buried and revealed in cycles more turbulent than ours. The very script of deep time might write itself differently, skipping chapters or crowding them, as if Earth were in a hurry to tell its story under impatient light. And yet, fossils, those quiet messengers left from bone and shell, would still rise. Imagine them preserved not with the memory of a single sun, but with two, their isotopes humming with signatures of dual parents. Each fossil, each tiny trace of calcium or carbon, would hold whispers of two different stellar fingerprints. Science tells us isotopes remember energy. They are time capsules of radiation and decay. In a two-sun Earth, they would lock into place a doubled signature, a geological diary written not in ink but in elemental song. We could read them and hear, in silence, how much sunlight once poured across their lives before their turning back into dust. And with dust, another thought. Dust is nothing and dust is everything. It is ground bone and shattered mountain. It is pollen, ash, and meteor. It floats endlessly until it settles, layer upon layer, recording ages gone. What dust would fall in a world where night never comes? Would its grains glow differently, bleached pale by endless photons from two opposing skies? Would every desert shimmer with double brilliance, each grain an echo of light repeated twice? Across millennia, this dust would not only blanket the earth, it would become memory itself, a veil of forgotten epochs, drifting across continents like a whisper from civilizations we had long left behind. But time itself, under dual suns, does not flow as easily. Time is perception sculpted by contrasts. The brightness of day, the stillness of night, the ripple of shadow moving across a wall. If light is constant, time may thicken, blur, expand. Without darkness to mark endings, one day may bleed quietly into another, indistinguishable. Centuries might feel weightless, indistinct, as if the planet itself were erasing its own boundaries of before and after. In such a place, memory might feel unreliable. What if our very identities are anchored in shadow? And if shadow never comes, who do we become? Standing in this imagined world, you might think of silence. Night often brings silence. The stillness of fields, the pause of creatures, the settling of mountains under starlight. But here, silence would no longer belong to darkness. It would belong to the unbroken shimmer of endless daylight, a silence that exists without contrast, without pause. Would that silence feel comforting, or would it feel like being gently erased, washed slowly into eternity with no place to retreat? And still we ask, what if the earth had never known night? Would civilizations even exist in the way we understand them? Would myths imagine not a singular god of light, but twin spirits pulling the sky apart? Perhaps calendars would divide not into hours, but into alignments, when one sun rises while the other falls, when both stand high, when both vanish across the opposite horizon. A culture shaped not by sunrise and sunset, but by a geometry of fire always shifting overhead. What is certain is only this: a dual sun Earth would hold a different story of geology, of biology, and of consciousness itself. Layers of sediment would fold faster, isotopes would tell deeper tales, civilizations would speak with languages of doubled time. Such a planet would remind us that memory itself is fragile, that what we think of as natural nightfall, stillness, darkness, is not inevitable, but a gift shaped by circumstance. And yet, if whole worlds can alter their very sense of rhythm simply by the number of stars they orbit, if so much of perception is tied to light, then what else about our lives might change under a second sun? If the beginning is this unstable, what would it mean when life itself tries to take hold in a world of perpetual glow? If the beginning is this unstable, if the very rhythm of life depends on the number of suns a world can call its own, then what happens when two stars are born together, bound in one long dance? Twin stars are not a rarity in the galaxy. They are, in many regions, the rule rather than the exception. Astronomers call them binaries, systems where two fires share gravity like a tether, their orbits entwined in spirals that last for billions of years. Their union is not fleeting. It is slow, patient, inevitable. And if Earth had been placed here, in such a double cradle, every measure of time, every measurement of being, would have unfolded differently. In this vision, we return to the first nights of the universe, though night itself is never without glow. A binary star does not burn evenly. One might be hotter, brighter, looming, the other cooler, smaller, casting a gentler flame. Together, they are a balance. Two voices speaking at once, sometimes harmonizing, sometimes clashing. For a planet caught between their gazes, this means the seasons would not belong to a single repeating orbit, but to shifting alignments. Summers might grow long, extended by double heat. Winters might vanish quickly or, under orbital tilt, stretch bizarrely depending on which star is closer, which is dimmer, which is hiding behind the other. Time itself folds differently under two suns. Years refuse to be steady. And so geology, our quiet planetary clock, would pulse at a new tempo. Heating and cooling cycles would quicken erosion. Mountain chains, uplifted slowly by tectonic drive, would crumble faster under the expanded energy that never gives way. Oceans would churn more violently, evaporating in endless rhythm, feeding skies that are forever restless with storms. Water cycles might overlap, not once but twice, stacking floods upon floods again. Imagine rivers that rise and fall not with the steady seasons we know, but with double surges stirred by a dual sky. These rivers would cut new deltas, broader and more tangled, feeding sediments into oceans faster than tectonic plates can swallow them. Entire epochs of stone might compress in what feels like mere chapters of time. Scientists studying isotope trails would find something uncanny here. In our world, isotopes tell the story of a single sun, the amount of carbon, oxygen, uranium recording not just decay, but sunlight's touch, the balance of heat and cycle. In a dual sun Earth, isotopes would tell twin tales, each signature layered upon the other. Like overlapping voices in a choir, the atoms themselves would whisper the existence of two parents. Reading them, we might ask, were the rocks confused, or did they carry clarity, a certainty of double belonging? Could an isotope tell the silence between both voices, those delicate pauses in which a planet briefly exhaled between double tides of light? And the atmosphere, how would it hold itself in such a place? Gases dance in equilibrium, shaped by the steady hand of solar input. Two fires would apply two pressures. Non-equilibrium would be the rule, not the exception. The sky might be thicker, winds sharper, air currents tangled. The polar patterns we know may dissolve, replaced by a restless circulation that refuses stillness. Clouds themselves might carry two sunlit faces at once. One side burning orange, the other glowing pale, a rolling theater of light that never knows closure. In such skies, sunsets would last longer, layered like music that never ends. Would civilizations of this earth remember change differently? Or would change itself become so constant it was invisible? We are used to night as silence. But under two stars, silence might come not from darkness, but from the pause of orbital rhythm, the slow crossing when one sun eclipses the other. Imagine the awe, a rare softening, a rare shadow, a fleeting hush that cultures would cherish as sacred. Eclipses would not be accidents here. They would be the breathing space of time itself. People might learn to measure their lives by them, counting generations not by years or seasons, but by how many times one flame swallowed the other in the quiet sky. And yet, entropy does not vanish in double brilliance. In fact, it lingers all the more closely, because two stars are themselves destined for change. Stars age at different rates. Hydrogen thins, helium thickens, cores collapse, and one may swell into a dying giant while the other still shines steady. What, then, becomes of a world that has known two fires if one begins to falter? Could an entire civilization feel as though one half of its identity was fading, the very foundation of perception burning out? Would memory itself fracture into halves, some tethered to one sun, others to the other? Maybe such a world would teach us that stability is an illusion, that even light itself is fragile when forced to share. Maybe time, as humans define it, would never grow neat in such a place. Instead of days and nights, time would be written in alignments, tilts, and separations, a ceaseless recalibration of presence. And within that shifting stage, people might ask themselves not how to mark the hours, but how to anchor meaning when the markers keep moving. And that question, how do we carve meaning in a world made of two competing lights, follows us gently into the next wonder. For if a planet can orbit between two fires, if seas and stones can hold the imprint of doubled heat, then how do we begin to imagine life itself, shaped not by shadow and contrast, but by the perpetual embrace of twin horizons? If a planet can orbit between two fires, if seas and stones can hold the imprint of doubled heat, then how do we begin to imagine life itself, shaped not by shadow and contrast, but by the perpetual embrace of twin horizons? A thought flows quietly from here. Without true darkness, what does the body become? Our cells, our hearts, our breathing all move to a rhythm, an invisible music called the circadian cycle. It is guided by light and silence, by the turning of night into morning and morning into afternoon. But when night never arrives, that music falters, its notes stretching thin across an endless stage of brightness. We drift into biology and into speculation, wondering whether sleep would remain as we know it, or if it too would dissolve into fragments of memory. On our Earth, sleep is a contract between our species and night. As the world cools and shadows return, the brain answers with stillness, letting chemicals rise and sink like tides, drawing us into inward landscapes of dream. But in an Earth beneath two suns, darkness would never come easily. Sleep would not be waiting at the edges but scattered, fragile, appearing like moments of surrender under constant glare. Some might learn to rest in short intervals, broken by bursts of wakefulness. Others might live almost without stillness, their bodies learning to conserve in silence even while awake. The boundary between dream and day would blur, until existence felt like one long, shining vigil. This carries us into subtle terrain, the perception of time itself. Our sense of passing hours rests on contrast. The slow dim of dusk reminds us that a day has ended. The hush of night tells us that another will follow. Remove this pattern and what remains? Hours bleed into hours. Memory struggles to tether itself. A lifetime could feel stretched like golden thread, without clear breaks to mark one age from the next. Maybe childhood, adulthood, and age itself dissolve into one brightness, unbroken. Maybe time, under two suns, becomes less of a measure and more of a long, indistinct hum. Yet within this imagined hum, biology finds new adaptations. Look at how animals survive on our Earth in extreme cycles. Reindeer carving lives under Arctic light that lasts months, penguins adjusting to polar nights, plants timing blossoms not to hours but to seasonal thresholds. Life accepts instability, sculpting itself into forms that fit whatever rhythm the planet allows. Perhaps under two suns, humanity would grow toward new thresholds too. Eyes shielded to soften glare, skins adapted to filter double radiance, minds learning to dream awake, drifting in half-light even while standing. Could such people still be us? Or would we seem to ourselves as strangers, born from the same origins but pushed into another destiny by the absence of shadow? And silence, where would silence hide? Not in the dark, because dark no longer guides the world. Perhaps silence falls instead between heartbeats, within caves where sunlight rarely steps, deep in oceans where light fades even under two blazing skies. In these hidden spaces, we might still find rest, small refuges for our fragile patterns, pockets of stillness preserved like fossils of the old rhythm. The caves, the trenches, the cracks in mountains. Might they become sacred, as the last places where a true night could still be imagined? And might our civilizations shape stories around them, as doorways to forgotten balance, as proof that darkness itself was not lost but merely waiting, patient? Under such conditions, entropy in the body and in civilization might arrive sooner. Sleeplessness shortens memory, weakens repair, frays connections. Over generations, stories might vanish quicker, traditions slipping before they can be passed. How much history would be lost if our very biology kept forgetting? How would civilizations preserve continuity when time itself refuses to pause? Could it be that whole cultures might exist like dreams one cannot quite recall, etched softly in stone, then erased by brightness, leaving only shadows of meaning buried under shifting sands? We hold this thought gently, like dust in our palms. If time bends when darkness is absent, if memory itself grows fragile beneath a ceaseless glow, perhaps the earth would not speak to us in nights and mornings at all. Perhaps it would turn to oceans, to their vast reflective skin, to remind us in shimmering waves that energy has always been restless, and water never forgets the suns above it. For even without nights to guide us, the seas would still collect the fire, reflect it, scatter it, and carry it back to the sky. And so, if life must bend in sleepless brightness, then what stories might oceans tell us in return, as mirrors of perpetual light? Oceans are the great record-keepers of energy. They take sunlight into themselves, absorb it, scatter it, and send it back in glimmers too vast for us to measure. With two suns above, every surface of water becomes doubled in fire. Waves would not only shimmer, they would fracture light into endless overlapping constellations, each ripple catching two sources, bending them together, and returning a glow that flickers like living memory. To stand upon the shore of such a world would be to see not a single horizon gleaming, but a restless lattice of brightness, as though the sea itself had become a second sky. But reflection is not only vision, it is heat. More light means more warmth drawn into water, and the oceans, vast as they are, cannot simply keep such energy without consequence. Currents would change first. The delicate conveyor belt of salt and temperature that now flows across our world, the one that carries warmth north and returns cold south, would move differently, pulled by stronger gradients, perhaps broken into fragments of smaller loops. Entire currents might quicken, redirect, or even stop altogether, rewriting climates continent by continent. Coastlines would drift too, though not because of tectonics alone. Water expanding with heat pushes against land, and under two suns this expansion would be relentless. Seas would rise higher, not always from ice melt but from the sheer swelling of warmed liquid, turning valleys to bays, peninsulas to islands. The edge between land and sea would never rest but creep inward, year after year, dissolving the map into something uncertain, as if the earth itself no longer cared about boundaries we thought eternal. Yet oceans are not only surfaces, they are columns of memory. In their depths, light normally fades after only a few hundred meters. But under two suns, light might reach further, deeper, soft golden traces sliding into zones that, in our world, see only shadow. Creatures evolved for darkness would find themselves in a half-day that never ends. Entire ecosystems of deep sea, usually shaped by blackness and chemical venting, might disappear or transform into something unrecognizable, life sculpted by a glow it never once expected. Could eyes emerge even in the abyss? Could colors bloom where once only pale skin and blindness ruled? Still deeper, where heat and pressure reign, subduction zones would continue their steady swallowing of seafloor. But the story of that seafloor would also change. Sediment drifting from land, carried by rivers rushing under exaggerated hydrological cycles, drops grain by grain into the ocean's silence. In our world, sediments form calm layers. In this imagined earth, they arrive in bursts, in floods of erosion, washed faster, thicker, stacked with restless rhythm. The rock they one day become would be hurried, packed with isotope trails recording 2 solar signatures instead of 1. To read such stone would be to feel the hurried heart of a planet beneath an unending glow. And what of storms? Warm seas are the birthplaces of tempests, their energy given to sky in spiraling towers of cloud. With oceans holding more heat, storms would be no longer rare moments of fury but constant rhythms of atmosphere. Winds tearing across continents, rains falling heavier and faster, lightning striking in endless cycles, all choreographed by seas that never sleep. Perhaps these storms would become normalized, etched into ordinary life, houses and minds built not against them but within them, much as we now live alongside rain or tide. This raises a quiet question. In such a world, would stillness be remembered? Or would the idea of a calm ocean become myth, a whispered story passed along by those who dreamed of lull, of horizons at rest? Maybe the sea itself would become a metaphor for memory, alive, unsettled, yet always returning its fragments against the land as soft foam. And we must wonder too, what would the human spirit feel, gazing upon such waters? Would we find awe in the doubled shimmer, or restlessness in its refusal to dim? Would reflection itself become unsettling, to see not one sun mirrored but 2, faces tangled, never apart? Perhaps the sea, once our great cradle, would no longer comfort us but remind us, gently but insistently, that with more light comes more entropy, more shift, more things lost to the fragile contract between stability and change. Because water, more than rock, more than air, bears the imprint of time. Every wave that breaks upon the shore is a memory of energy arriving, an echo of suns above, scattered into motion. And with 2 suns, those echoes would grow louder, longer, more insistent, until it becomes impossible to stand at the water's edge without feeling that the sea is a restless memory, one that refuses to forget. And yet, if oceans themselves can lose stillness and become restless under twin flames, what of the land they cradle? How would Earth's stones, its cliffs and canyons, endure under perpetual day? If water carries memory back and forth, then perhaps rock, under constant light, carries the story of erosion in even sharper silence. If oceans themselves can lose stillness and become restless under twin flames, what of the land they cradle? What of the cliffs and mountains that rise above the tide, the stones that believe themselves eternal? Rock does not live, and yet it changes. It does not breathe, and yet it remembers. It is the slow memory of a planet, kept in layers, fractures, and dust. And under 2 suns, those memories would not last as they do in our world. They would be erased faster, reshaped more often, whispered into silence by erosion that never sleeps. Take a mountain, newly risen from tectonic collision, sharp and jagged in its youth. Our Earth grants it long seasons of wearing down, rain slowly carving channels, wind carrying grains into valleys, frost hiding in cracks to widen them year after year. But in a world of perpetual day, the energy is relentless. Heat expands rock by day, cools it by night. But here, with night diminished, the balance falters, the expansion prolonged. The stone grows fragile, pulled apart by thermal strain. Cracks appear earlier, cliffs tumble sooner, the mountain's grandeur collapsing in centuries where it might otherwise last millennia. And the rivers, the restless hands of erosion, would run more violently too. Fed by oceans that conjure more evaporation beneath their doubled light, rains would come fierce and sudden, not as soft seasons but as sweeping deluges breaking across slopes. Water etches ravines quicker, strips soil from roots before forests can anchor, and tears minerals loose in torrents that rush unceasing into the sea. Sediments gather and resettle, only to rise again in new forms. Valleys deepen, then vanish beneath floods, then appear once more in another place. Landscapes become unstable maps, restless drawings rewritten in stone and water together. Deserts, too, would speak differently. In deserts as we know them, light sharpens edges, wind gathers sand, and dunes march across empty basins. But in a two-sun desert, shadows themselves stutter, never truly aligning, never marking just one edge of a dune but two. Heat enters stone more directly, grains break faster, and dust becomes endless. These deserts might grow so vast they circle continents, seas of shifting memory where stone loses its cohesion and becomes an ocean of its own. An ocean not of water, but of ground memory shattered into dust. Even fossils, those rare traces of life turned to stone, would struggle. Fossilization relies on quick burial and preservation from weathering. On such an Earth, where erosion moves swiftly, bones might disintegrate before they find refuge in sediment. Entire epochs of beings could vanish without geological record. What if whole histories of life played out and passed, but left no bones to carry their whisper forward? Could it be that civilization itself might emerge one day, unaware that countless worlds of creatures had lived and disappeared before it, simply because light erased their traces too quickly? Memory, then, is not only fragile in the body but dissolves in the very stones meant to protect it. And yet, erosion is not only erasure, it is also creation. The loss of a cliffside is the birth of a canyon. The silting of a river valley is a new place for life to gather. Dust rising into the sky carries nutrients to oceans, feeding blooms of plankton that breathe oxygen into the air. Under twin suns, these cycles would quicken, decay and renewal overlapping, death and rebirth written as one continuous script. Perhaps we would learn to see landscapes differently, not as things that last, but as things that pass. Not because the land is weak, but because under so much light, impermanence is the only law. And so, erosion itself becomes a kind of planetary entropy, geology dissolving into grains of time. Valleys fall, mountains flatten, deserts drift, civilizations build upon crumbling ground. Nothing can claim permanence here, but everything whispers transformation. You and I, standing in such a place, might wonder, is it even possible to remember something that refuses to stay still? When the land itself erases its own outline daily, what becomes of memory? And yet, even as stone turns to sand, and mountains retreat into plains, life has always sheltered beneath forests. If on this double-sun Earth erosion rewrites the ground, we must next ask how trees and wild green things might stretch toward such endless skies. How would forests grow, bathed in perpetual day, holding their twin shadows like secrets whispered back to the earth? If erosion reshapes the ground beneath our feet, if stone turns to dust and valleys collapse into plains, then we must look upward to the beings that reach beyond the soil, toward the twin suns above. Forests, those vast cathedrals of living matter, would not vanish in perpetual day. They would adapt, stretching into the glow, weaving themselves into patterns almost beyond our comprehension. Imagine standing beneath trees whose branches never rest in darkness, where every leaf is turned not toward a single source but split between two, each one catching a different angle of brilliance, painting the forest floor with overlapping shadows. Two shadows for every trunk. two shifting silhouettes for every blade of grass. A ground alive with doubling, flickering in ways the eye might never settle upon. The world itself becoming an unsettled canvas of light and memory. With more energy pouring down, photosynthesis would surge. On our Earth, plants have limits, thresholds built by solar saturation. Under twin suns, those thresholds might be tested daily, forcing vegetation higher, thicker, heavier with stored sugar and starch. Perhaps trees would not simply grow taller, but stranger, their leaves designed to scatter excess light, to shield themselves against burning radiance. Forests might darken even under perpetual flame, densely layered canopies so thick that they form night within, a second world hidden in shadow. And maybe that would be the only night left, a hushed shelter inside green cathedrals where perpetual brightness had no power. But forests are not only lungs breathing in sunlight, they are time made visible. When we cut them open, the rings tell years, the scars tell of droughts, floods, fire. Yet what if years themselves blur in a place where seasons overlap and never pause? Would a tree's rings lose their clarity, merging into swells of wood without pattern? Perhaps trunks would grow with bands too thick, too chaotic for easy interpretation, a muddled script of survival beneath competing suns. Maybe we would stare into the cross-section of an ancient tree and see not a timeline, but something more like a weathered fingerprint, unique but unreadable, a signature without a story. And how would creatures live among them? Forests channel energy, shaping food webs that stretch from root to canopy. More photosynthesis means more energy pulsing upward, fruit ripening faster, growth abundant. Would animals evolve in greater numbers, rising to claim the surplus? Or would abundance bring fragility, ecosystems burning themselves too quickly, collapsing beneath their own accelerations? Perhaps life in these forests would be vivid but fleeting, blooming and disappearing in patterns like lightning across the horizon. Seen, felt, then gone too fast to remember. In this layered glow, perception itself might shift. Imagine walking through such a forest, with two suns at your back, two shadows stretching ahead, leaves above glowing with double translucence. It would feel as though the forest carried two versions of itself, the visible body of bark and leaf, and a second forest of shadows tracing it, always following but never truly the same. Would we learn to see both at once? Would we come to think of every living thing as having two identities, not because of myth but because of the doubled evidence before our eyes? Maybe forests of two shadows would remind us that we, too, carry twin selves, the living body moving forward, and the quieter imprint left behind, always shifting in silence. Geologically, forests root us into soil, slowing erosion, anchoring ground against the tearing force of storm. But with erosion already magnified under twin suns, would their roots be enough? Could forests withstand rivers carving faster, rains thrashing heavier, stones dissolving beneath them? Or would forests themselves drift like waves, growth collapsing into decay in shorter intervals, then regrowing taller as excess light demands? A restless cycle. Rise, fall, rise again. A system as fragile as it is abundant, as temporary as it is colossal. Perhaps the greatest wonder would be silence. Standing among twin shadow trees, we might hear wind threading through double canopies, a sound not foreign but doubled, layered like whispers speaking at once. Not simply the hush of leaves, but two hushing voices spilling together. Silence itself would bend, take on new textures, altered by the simple existence of twin horizons. And if forests, those giants of the land, could shift so profoundly under perpetual glow, then what of the smaller beings, the lives caught between decay and preservation, whose chance at memory depends not on towering branches but on how quickly they can leave their imprint in stone? For light, so bountiful, also accelerates endings, which means we must next descend, past these green cathedrals, into the realm of fossils, those fragile remains turned to rock beneath skies forever bright. And if forests, those giants of the land, could shift so profoundly under perpetual glow, then what of the smaller beings, the lives caught between decay and preservation, whose chance at memory depends not on towering branches but on how quickly they can leave their imprint in stone? For every forest, every meadow, every stretch of coast holds a secret. Beneath its roots, its soil, its flowing rivers, lie the remains of countless creatures. Every fall of bone, every shell, every leaf drifting into sediment is an attempt at memory. Fossils are not only relics of bodies once alive, they are the handwriting of time itself, scrawled into stone grain by grain. Here, under brighter skies, the hand that writes changes. The heat is more relentless, the processes of decay quicker, the rhythm of burial altered. On our Earth, bones may lie long before sediments cover them, slowly shielding the fragile details that chance allows. But in the blaze of two suns, exposure gnaws quicker, surfaces crumble before sediment can settle. The record is not patient, it is hurried, fragmented, prone to dissolution. Whole lineages of beings may vanish without inscription, their chapters erased not because they were unworthy, but because the planet could not spare them protection. Memory itself becomes fragile, fading before it can set. Yet what is lost in one rhythm may be preserved in another. The very speed of erosion that denies some creatures fossilhood may also bury others more quickly. Animals drowned in floods brought by exaggerated rains might sink under sudden walls of silt and clay, captured in an instant by violent hydrology. Plants toppled in storms may vanish beneath collapsing rivers. In these moments, stillness is forced, and within that sudden burial, geology whispers back. What if fossils here are not fewer, but stranger, gathered in great, abrupt deposits, as if history wrote itself in punctuation rather than sentences? We must also ask how sunlight itself imprints upon the matter of life. Every bone, every shell locks isotopes in place, tiny signatures of the energy that once passed through it. On our Earth, we read these isotopes to recall climates, diets, waters, and skies. On a two-sun Earth, those isotopes would whisper of two fires. Carbon might record differing cycles of intensity. Oxygen might keep traces of atmospheres shifting under doubled influence. Uranium might carry decay patterns confused by overlaps of radiation. Each fossil would not be a single diary but a duet, two voices written into its chemistry, two rhythms shaping its silence. Imagine holding such a fossil in hand. The shape is familiar, a bone, a leaf, a shell. But reading into its structure, one feels astonishment. For its atoms speak the record of two skies. Its silence is not simple but doubled. Is this a quiet creature that walked unnoticed across a plain? Or is it the bridge between two suns, carrying their memory more faithfully than any living witness? Could it be that fossils in this world would become sacred not because of their rarity but because of their dual imprint? Living evidence that time itself had layered energy differently upon bodies? And yet fossils are not only memory, they are absences filled. They remind us that what once lived is gone, and that absence has been revisited endlessly by stone. Under deeper light, these absences grow more numerous. Perhaps vast epochs of life rise and vanish before stone has even noticed. Whole civilizations of insects, forests of strange plants, herds of animals adapted to twin shadows, all gone with no trace left in rock. In such a reality, would memory itself become humble? Would we realize that what survives in record is not chosen, not fair, not whole, but only what the earth was momentarily willing to hold? Still, fossils are time's anchors. Even under perpetual day, stone cannot help but preserve some. Pressed deep, heated slowly, carried under tectonic plates as the ocean floors sink into the planet's hidden core, fossils are dragged into silence beneath continents. Later, through collision and upheaval, they may rise again, fragments of seabed lifted high into new mountains. Bones of ocean creatures resting on peaks where rain now falls. Fossils remind us that nothing on Earth stays where it begins. Life drifts, sinks, resurfaces. Under twin suns, this drift is hurried, but no less profound. It is humbling to imagine how small we are beside this restless archive. Fossils are not stones of certainty, they are fragments of a larger silence. They tell us not just what lived, but how much has already been forgotten. And if under such skies more is lost, erased before inscription, then perhaps these fossils under brighter skies would feel even more like whispers of absence than voices of memory. not because they tell all, but because they remind us how much they cannot say. And yet, if bones and leaves can dissolve before burial, if whole epics can pass without leaving their script in rock, then what of the deeper stones themselves? If memory pressed into fossils fades, perhaps the very rock of Earth must serve as the next archive, recording light in its atoms, its isotopes, its silent, endless chemistry. If bones and leaves can dissolve before burial, if whole epics pass without leaving their script in rock, then what of the deeper stones themselves? When flesh cannot hold the memory, geology must step in. For stone is patient. It does not speak quickly, and it does not speak clearly, but it does record everything in fragments, in whispers, in traces that survive where bodies cannot. Under the glare of two suns, where fossils falter, stone becomes the archive, holding within its isotopes the story of fire and time. Every mineral carries a secret music. Atoms are not as silent as they seem, for they bear within them the echoes of light, the fingerprints of water, the memory of atmospheres long since gone. Carbon atoms that once cycled through forests return to stone, marking how much energy pressed against leaves, how much oxygen pulsed in air. Oxygen isotopes linger in shells and snow, testifying to temperatures, rains, even the breath of glaciers. Uranium and thorium decay slowly, like clocks buried within mountains, ticking away not in seconds but in ages, releasing their measure of deep time so that we, if we listen, may hear. On a two-sun Earth, these isotopes whisper differently. Carbon would not hold a single rhythm of energy but two overlapping ones, a braided pattern of brightness folded into every atom. Oxygen would contain not the familiar oscillation of summers and winters, but the confused doubling of heat cycles, a diary written in twin hands at once. Reading these isotopes, we might not discern neatly where one season ends and another begins. Instead, we might find a blur, like overlapping echoes in a canyon, voices calling from different directions, merging until they seem like one. Could it be that stone itself grows confused here, not static, not false, but layered with complexity that resists a human attempt to simplify? And yet the confusion would still be order, just an order too large for our narrow perception. Imagine a cliff face split by erosion, its layers exposed like a library of ages. We might see not steady bands but restless ones, layers built unevenly by faster heat, by heavier rains, by currents forever tugged by two sources. Each band carries isotopes, each isotope a timestamp. Together they compose not a linear script, but something wilder, a score of light written in two melodies. Perhaps if we could hear it, it would sound less like a steady ticking and more like overlapping waves, colliding, merging, fading, returning. Stone as a symphony of suns. Geologists reading such record would need to relearn their craft. The neat alternations of glacial cycles might vanish, replaced by hybrid patterns, ice appearing where it should not, vanishing when conditions still suggest its growth. Climate recorded in stone is the planet's autobiography, but here it would be nonlinear, complicated, an autobiography told in two voices, always in dialogue and never in agreement. Would we learn to read such stone as truth, or would it always feel as though gaps remained? Perhaps truth itself becomes plural here, twofold, doubling back on itself as time moves forward. And there is another wonder in stone: subduction. Oceans push their floors back into the planet's mantle, carrying with them isotopes and traces of what was. As slabs sink, they drag memory downward. And in that silence, under crushing heat far below, those isotopes do not simply vanish. They mix with melted rock, drift upward again, erupting from volcanoes, carrying tiny whispers to the surface after millions of years of silence. Imagine the significance. Even when light erases fossils too quickly, even when stone is buried so deep it forgets its own shape, still magma and mountain exhale tiny isotopic truths back into the air. The memory never ends. It only changes form. Perhaps that is what stone teaches us. Not permanence, but persistence. Not clarity, but survival. What is preserved is partial, scattered, prone to erasure, and yet enough remains to remind us what once was. In a world of brighter skies, Stone bears not a single story but two, a double memory woven into every mineral grain, every uplifted mountain, every particle of dust that drifts across seas before settling again. Maybe this is why we are drawn to cliffs, to canyons, to mountains cut open by time, because their faces stare back at us not only with silence, but with evidence. They prove that memory can endure without words, that it can be written in the smallest signatures of chemistry, in silent trails that do not lie. Yet even as we read them, we know we are reading only fragments, mysteries half-kept, diaries water-stained, pages burned by entropy. And yet, if stone itself can carry two voices at once, if the planet becomes its own diary of dual suns, then what of time itself? If the ground beneath our feet never forgets, what does it mean for us, tiny travelers upon its surface, to walk upon a memory that is always fading even as it endures? It means we step in the realm of entropy, that quiet, inevitable dissolution threaded through every process we know. Entropy is not cruel. It is not violent. It is the soft unraveling of order into the countless grains of possibility. It is the gentle drift from clarity to blur, from pattern to scattering, from permanence to impermanence. And under the radiance of two suns, entropy does not wear a single cloak, but two. On our world, entropy is patient. Rocks break into sand, bodies collapse to soil, stars themselves cool into silence. But in a land of perpetual brightness, this patience is shortened. Heat exists not as punctuation but as persistence, battering matter into quicker surrender. Metals tarnish faster, their surfaces corroding in relentless exposure. Wood decays sooner, baked and split under a doubled gaze. Even water, which seems eternal, weathers into new chemistries as evaporation rises, salts concentrating, oceans altering their balance of minerals. Nothing stands immune, nothing pauses. Entropy wears its first cloak in the physical, in the visible breakdown of things. Buildings crumble, leaves dry to dust, bones erode before burial. Civilizations, in such day, might see their monuments reduced far sooner, their written tablets effaced, their sculptures softened into unrecognizable lumps by storms accelerated through endless energy. To live here is to understand that permanence was always a comforting story, one told against the louder truth, that nothing wishes to stay still. Perhaps we would learn not to build for eternity, but for renewal, accepting dissolution as part of the design. Maybe impermanence would not frighten us. Maybe it would become home. But entropy wears another cloak, too. The second is quieter, less visible. The erosion of memory. Memory, whether imprinted in fossils or carried by brain and culture, is fragile enough under one sun. Under two, where decay is quicker, where night seldom soothes, memory may fray prematurely. Stories may vanish within generations, not because they were unworthy or ignored, but because there was never stillness enough to hold them. Civilizations may rise in brilliance and collapse into forgetting, leaving only fragments scattered in stone. And if stone itself, as we have said, records two voices at once, then memory carried forward may confuse, a blending of origins that feels unsteady, like trying to recall a dream that changes as you hold it. Is it possible that identity itself bends beneath entropy's twin cloaks? On one level, we cherish our sense of self as continuous, as though who we are tonight is who we were yesterday. But entropy teaches another truth. Even as we breathe, our cells mutate, our molecules scatter, our bodies dissolve in slow rehearsal for their end. Each of us is less permanent than we imagine, and in a two-sun world, that rehearsal accelerates further. Perhaps here, people would not clutch identity as a fixed truth. Perhaps they would hold it like water cupped in hands, aware it is always slipping, always becoming other. In geology, entropy is deep time revealed. Mountains once tall become plains, rivers once forceful become deltas, continents once connected drift apart. In biology, entropy is extinction. Species once dominant vanish, replaced by new forms that rise and fade again. In civilizations, entropy is forgetting, the slow loss of knowledge to silence. With two suns, these three tempos converge more swiftly. Plains arrive before we notice mountains. Species die before we can write their names in stone. Libraries dissolve into dust before future generations arrive to remember them. Perhaps entropy here is not cruel, but more honest. More direct in reminding us that all we ever cradle is temporary. And yet entropy is not only destruction, it is also possibility. For disorder means freedom, it means the rearrangement of particles into new arrangements. New lives. A fallen mountain releases minerals to valleys. A collapsed civilization leaves fragments others will build upon. Even fading memory makes room for the imagination, for new mythologies to fill the absence. Could it be that entropy's two cloaks, though heavy, are blessings in disguise? A constant reminder that the world is not stagnant, that even under ceaseless brightness rebirth waits hidden inside loss? Entropy, then, becomes not an enemy but a teacher. It does not shout. It does not hurry. It only whispers. Everything will scatter, everything will blend, but nothing truly disappears. And as we reflect on this under two suns, the question deepens. If entropy moves faster here, if the cloaks it wears are heavier, then how many times would life itself be forced to begin again? How many worlds of creatures, how many forests, how many civilizations would collapse into ash, leaving only space for others to rise? And yet, if entropy shortens lifespans and magnifies forgetting, then the story of the planet becomes a story of cycles repeating more urgently than ever. And so we ask, what kind of endings might we find here? What extinctions under dual flames would shape not only life, but absence itself? And what cycles are heavier, more final than extinction? We know, in our own Earth's history, life has been thinned not once, but many times. 5 great extinctions at least, and countless smaller ones, each reshaping the wing beats, the footprints, the echoes that filled the world. They came through fire, through ice, through choking oceans and falling stones. But what if, beneath the reign of two suns, extinction itself became a different rhythm, less an exception than a constant drumbeat, endlessly accelerating? Excess sunlight changes everything. Too much heat, and oceans no longer breathe. Warm waters lose their oxygen. Blooms of life suffocate and fall into stillness, drifting to the seafloor in silent cascades of death. Too much radiation, and DNA unravels faster, mutations multiplying, some giving life a chance to adapt, others dissolving lineages before they can spread. Entire species might vanish within centuries rather than millions of years, not because of asteroids, but because the very ceiling of the sky pressed too heavily on them. Extinction forged not by singular cataclysm, but by relentless light. Imagine the age of reptiles under such skies. On our Earth, dinosaurs ruled for more than 160 million years, their shadows stretching over valleys and plains with a patience that feels unthinkable. But under dual suns, could they have lasted so long? Would forests, overheated and weather-beaten, have supported their scale? Would nests have survived in soils too dry, too unstable, washed away by torrential cycles of flood and drought? Perhaps dinosaurs or any large creature would struggle here, too vulnerable to fragile ecosystems that cannot hold their weight. Maybe the giants of life would exist, but only briefly, bright and fleeting, before flame and instability demanded something smaller, something quicker to carry life forward. This thought is humbling. That size itself becomes fragile under brighter skies. Not because larger bodies lack strength, but because their survival depends too much on stability. And perhaps, in a double-sun Earth, stability is the rarest thing of all. The survivors, then, might be the overlooked, the insects, the burrowing small lives that do not need permanence, that thrive in chaos. Could extinction itself favor not the powerful, but the quiet? Not the loud rulers of forests and seas, but those who can vanish from sight, sleep in soil, outlast the burn? Extinctions are not only endings, they are also catalysts. Each collapse reshapes the pathways of life, forcing detours, opening niches, giving rise to forms we could not predict. Under two suns, these catalysts may arrive more often. Civilizations of creatures may never reach stability, yet from their interruptions, new experiments bloom. Entire ecosystems may last only a few million years before heat overturns them. Yet within those years, strange new forms of life appear, burn brightly, then fade. What is extinct here may be countless, but what arises might also be countless. Life forever reinventing itself in faster pulses, in shorter bursts of possibility. Perhaps creation itself would come to feel like extinction's sibling, inseparable, each chasing the other toward futures unknown. Geology would archive the losses in its way, if fragmentarily. Layers of rock would hold abrupt shifts. Strata where diverse fossils suddenly vanish, replaced by silence, then new floods of forms. Each extinction event carved not into myth but into mineral, a reminder that brightness itself carved endings. Yet we must wonder, how many of these events would survive the faster erosion, the restless rewriting of stone? Could it be that entire extinctions might leave little trace, their vanishings as untethered from the future as the lives themselves? Forgotten not because they were unseen, but because the record itself eroded too soon. And does this not mirror memory in us? When civilizations fall, what remains? Broken monuments, scattered inscriptions, and fragments of stories only half preserved. Under two suns, perhaps even our ruins would wear away too quickly for the future to know we had been. Whole cultures may rise, collapse, vanish, and leave not a single echo of themselves in stone. Could extinction extend even to memory, so that not only life itself disappears, but any dream that it had once been? Still, extinction is never final in the truest sense. Life returns, again and again, because entropy may scatter but never annihilates. Molecules return to soil, to ocean, to air. New combinations arise, new bodies form, new creatures stretch into light. In a two-sun Earth, perhaps extinctions come more often, but so too do resurrections. Every ending seeds beginning. Every collapse gives rise to new gardens, strange and unthinkable in their forms. And yet, if endings shape beginnings, if brightness itself reshuffles the story of life again and again, then the climate in which these cycles unfold becomes the frame of the entire narrative. And so we must turn gently to climate itself, not fixed, but oscillating, restless under dual fires. If extinctions are carved in fire, what does climate become when its rhythms are doubled too? If extinctions are carved in fire, if life itself is reshuffled again and again beneath the heat of dual suns, then climate becomes the frame, the restless stage on which all cycles play. Climate is rhythm. It is not a single moment, not a single storm, not the weather of a day, but the deep pattern of air and sea breathing together, measuring the planet's heart across centuries. And under two suns, this rhythm does not move in steady arcs. It tangles, overlaps, stutters and surges, never quite repeating its melody, never quite still. On our Earth, we speak of seasons as if they are predictable arrangements. Summer leaning into autumn, winter softening into spring. But seasons are the children of orbit and tilt, dependent on a singular flame. How would those children behave with two parents above? Perhaps there would be summers within summers, layered intensities where the warming of one sun crests just as the other reaches its peak. Heat compounded, crowds of hot days strung endlessly together, oceans steaming with imbalance. Then, maybe, winters not as we know them, but fractured and inconsistent, arriving early one year, vanishing the next, their stability undermined by cyclical interference. Could there even be ice ages here? Or would the very idea of deep cold be fragile, a temporary shadow between pulses of energy that never quite retreat? Geology would remember these climates in its own slow way. Ice, if it grew at all, would trap bubbles of confused atmospheres, isotopes of oxygen telling stories of summers that stretched too long or arrived doubled upon one another. Sediment at the bottom of lakes would stack unevenly, wider bands for the years when both suns pressed harder together, thinner ones for the rare intervals when their paths softened into respite. Reading such records would not offer curves and cycles so much as spiraling knots, a climate always folding into itself, never granting repetition without disruption. For life, climate is law. It dictates migration, flowering, hibernation, all the subtle dance steps that tie existence to Earth's turning. But in a two-sun world, those signals would blur. Birds might try to follow warmth but find it never recedes. Plants might begin to bud, then stall, then bloom again, confused by conflicting pulses. Perhaps evolution would meet this instability by abandoning pattern altogether. New species arising that no longer seek rhythm from the sky but invent their own, tuned only to their immediate place and moment. Life adapting not to a cycle but to constant improvisation. Could it be that intelligence itself is sharpened in such climates, forced to anticipate the unpredictable, to invent memory and imagination as tools of survival? But climate is not only external, it shapes perception too. We, who measure our lives with summers, birthdays, rains, might feel untethered without steady repetition. A childhood without predictable seasons may feel like a blur without markers, a story without chapters. Time itself may become looser, stranger, harder to fix. Maybe this world would raise people who do not measure in years or moons but in alignments. When the suns part, when they draw near, when the climate turns unstable. The calendar of such a world would be vast and complex, less about steady months, more about unpredictable moments. Reminders that balance is an illusion, and change is the only clock that never halts. Atmospheres, too, would find themselves torn. Two suns pressing more energy means more evaporation, more storms, more restless air searching for equilibrium. Winds would rise in tangled currents, layers of jet streams weaving against each other, never standard, never still. Rain would fall not where it once belonged but where chance placed it. Floods in deserts, droughts in valleys, each year a new improvisation. Could silence still exist in such a climate? Or would even still days carry an echo of instability, the air itself remembering the chaos that came before and bracing for its return? And yet, even here, beauty would swell. Imagine skies painted not only in hues of one setting sun but two, their lights blending at dusk into colors beyond our imagination. Imagine the sound of forests adapting, the chorus of insects not tied to predictable summers but alive in kaleidoscopic surges, their legacies brief but brilliant. Imagine glaciers glowing under two dawns at once, recording for as long as they last the impossible story of a climate always moving, never repeating, never truly calm. And yet, just as climate holds memory in ice, in sediments, in storms, the sky holds memory, too. For the atmosphere itself is a canvas of scattering light, painting slow, shifting stories above our heads. If the rhythm of climate under two suns is never still, what shifting kaleidoscope might the sky itself reveal, and what forgotten wisdom might its hues contain? If the rhythm of climate under two suns is never still, then the sky itself becomes the theater in which this restless symphony is performed. Look upward, and suddenly the entire world feels different. The atmosphere, thin and fragile, draped loosely around the planet like a veil, becomes more than air. It becomes memory. It holds light, bends it, scatters it, until the heavens are painted over and over again in colors no eye has fully learned how to describe. The sky, in its silence, remembers every photon, every moment that the suns spill across it, and in those memories, it stores a wisdom forgotten by the ground. On our Earth, sunlight scatters in familiar ways. Short wavelengths paint the day blue, long ones stretch into sunsets of orange and gold. But under twin suns, the scattering would double, blending wavelengths into new harmonies. A sunset might not simply shift from blue to orange, but unfold in layers upon layers. A sky at once turquoise and crimson, violet and pale green, as two giants of fire send their light across dust and vapor. Dawn may not be a single rising, but a folding of light, one orb cresting as the other lingers, their halos weaving until it is impossible to say when morning has truly begun or ended. Could it be that in such skies, time itself loses meaning, and we live within a canvas of perpetual becoming? The atmosphere does not only paint, it holds chemistry, it breathes with gases, it holds records in its shifting balance. Every volcanic eruption, every ocean exhalation, every leaf giving off oxygen is written here, mixed and stored for those who learn to listen. In bubbles of ancient ice, we on Earth read the sky's forgotten diaries, seeing carbon rise and fall with ages, tracing patterns of warmth, of glaciation, of collapse. But a two-sun Earth would write a more complex script. Carbon would rise in waves, not one but two cycles bending it. Oxygen would falter and surge in overlapping signals, confounding interpretation. Would the sky itself seem confused, or would it simply be more complete than our understanding can reach? And in this confusion lies beauty, because disorder is only disorder from the limited view of those who expect simplicity. Perhaps the heavens on such a world would seem chaotic to us, overwhelmed with color, swirling with contradictory energies. But perhaps for those who lived beneath them, the sky would feel natural, not confused but whole. Maybe children born into this light would see clarity where we see blur. Clouds that tell two stories at once, colors that convey two meanings simultaneously, a vision we cannot imagine because our eyes are bound to the memory of one sun. Could perception itself evolve from these skies, changing how thought and language unfold, making metaphors of duality part of every breath? And when night barely arrives, what does the sky become? Stars would be harder to see with so much ceaseless glow, constellations only rarely revealed in fleeting alignments of shadow. Perhaps myth here would not be drawn from points of starlight, but from the dance of two suns themselves, traced across the heavens like celestial storytellers repeating their cycle eternally. Maybe the wisdom of such a world would not come from distant galaxies but from the very sky above, day after day, tirelessly shifting its hues into infinite variations. Could the people here look upward and always feel that the sky is speaking directly to them, remembering for them, keeping what they cannot? And yet, skies are fragile. They can change, they can vanish, they can forget. On our Earth, mass extinctions have been accompanied by altered skies. Volcanic ash choking sunlight, suspended aerosols reflecting fire into cold, oxygen levels falling. Under two suns, the atmosphere might be under constant strain, always leaning on the edge of imbalance. What seems eternal may dissolve in only centuries, reminding us that even memory can be erased if the canvas is torn. The question lingers: does the sky remember every photon? Or are photons themselves too fleeting, too scattered, vanishing faster than stories can be etched? Perhaps the memory is not perfect, but partial, soft, blurred like the afterimage behind closed eyelids. Not accuracy, but feeling. Not history, but suggestion. The sky remembers not facts, but moods. Not moments, but echoes. And in those echoes lies the forgotten wisdom of existence, that nothing is permanent, yet nothing is entirely gone. For the sky that burned today will scatter again tomorrow, and again after that, always changing but always returning. And yet, if skies themselves can hold memories of suns, even in scattered fragments, then what might memory feel like in us? When morning and evening cease to mark boundaries, when two dawns weave into silence. What becomes of our perception when the very notion of daybreak is a shifting mirage, never quite here, never quite gone? Would time itself stretch differently if we woke not to a single rising but to a gradual overlapping of horizons? One star cresting as the other lingers, their blended light refusing to settle the question of when the day truly begins? On our Earth, dawn is clarity. The sky brightens, shadows retreat, and with the coming of light the body knows. Another day has begun. But here, under dual suns, clarity dissolves into ambiguity. The first horizon glows, the second hesitates, and morning becomes not a singular event but a conversation between two flames. Rituals built on certainty unravel. How do you decide when to eat, when to rest, when to begin again if morning itself has no singular voice? Perhaps time in such a world feels longer, stretched by the hesitation of two lights refusing to agree. The seconds linger, the transition drawn out, dawns extended like whispers repeated again and again. A child standing at a window might wonder when exactly the night has ended, and by the time one sun fully rises, the other is following in delay, already binding the next day into the present. Waking might never feel whole, but fragmented, perpetual, an endless drifting between two beginnings. And if there is no clean beginning, what does it mean for endings? Could it be that life here feels continuous, unbroken, as though existence itself has no pauses but only variations in brightness? Within us, bodies rely on rhythms. Sleep and waking, hunger, attention, all calibrated to contrasts of light and dark. Without that certainty, our inner clocks unravel, refusing to keep perfect time. Memory, too, hinges on rhythm. One event marked against another, separated by night like chapters of a book. But if night never crowns dawn with contrast, memory might blur. We might not remember events as distinct episodes but as flowing rivers, details dissolving quickly into continuous brightness. Maybe what survives are only fragments of impression. Sounds, scents, fleeting colors, streaming onward without anchor. Perhaps identity itself weakens, not because we are less, but because we never have a single dawn to remind us that we have begun again. But silence remains. Not silence of sound, but silence of meaning, of pause, of interval. Dawn, in our earthly life, carries a stillness. The quiet before birdsong, the hush before footsteps stir. Under two suns, where dawn overlaps dawn, maybe silence itself grows elongated, stretched across hours of hesitant light. We stand within it, uncertain if the day has changed or if we are still waiting. That long silence becomes its own ritual, a daily meditation not of action but of suspension. What kind of culture arises with such dawns? Perhaps calendars here no longer measure days at all, but shifts between major alignments of the suns. A society might gather when both dawns cross close together, marking that rare clarity as sacred. Or perhaps calendars fade, replaced by fluidity, by a shared acceptance that each day is not discrete but part of one continuous flow of light. Could myths form not around singular gods of the sunrise, but around twin spirits negotiating endlessly who carries the burden of light? Would morning prayers be offered twice, and if so, which one holds the true weight? Geology and atmosphere would archive these ambiguous mornings in their own language. The isotopes in ice, if any ice survives, would log blurred cycles of radiation exposure. Sediments washed into lakes would reflect floods driven not by clear seasons but by this doubled pulse of warming skies. Even the rocks would struggle to separate one dawn from another. In their confusion, they would reflect ours, reminders that time, as we measure it, is not universal but dependent on rhythm, on cycles, on contrasts we take for granted. And so memory falters. Language adapts. Silence stretches long across each horizon. What if this taught us a gentler truth? That perhaps time does not need segments. That beginnings do not need to be exact. That identity, too, may be more like light, shifting, doubled, never arriving whole, never departing entirely. And yet, if this is how dawn feels, never singular, always echoing against itself, then what of the smallest grains of earth beneath these dawns? If forests, fossils, skies, and even time dissolve into blur, then each grain of sand may hold an answer. A fragile twin echo carved by perpetual light, waiting to remind us of times passing in ways the suns alone cannot show. If forests dissolve into blur, if skies remember in shifting hues, if time itself is softened by overlapping light, perhaps sand, quiet, countless, humble sand, carries its own secret record of two suns. Sand is not born small. It begins as mountain, as cliff, as boulder lifted by tectonic will and raised into air. Rain, wind, frost, rivers. They carve stone slowly, grinding it down to fragments no wider than a breath. Over ages, rock surrenders until it becomes thousands of tiny crystals, each one carrying the history of larger forms within it. Sand is recycled mountain, broken memory scattered across valleys, deserts, and shorelines. On our earth, its glints are shaped by a single sun. But here, with two suns painting each particle from two directions, every grain becomes not just a fragment, but a twin echo, luminous with the imprint of dual fire. Imagine kneeling on a beach of such light, scooping a handful of grains while double suns crest overhead. The handful shimmers like powdered stars, not a single shimmer but two, each grain catching both horizons, scattering soft brightness into our vision at slightly different angles. To us, on such a shore, it might seem as though the sand is alive, breathing ceaselessly with two pulses. Could it be that in this world, the line between sea and land glows twice, a liminal place where memory itself insists on being doubled? Sunlight does not simply illuminate sand, it alters it. Minerals bleach in exposure, crystals darken with impurities, the surfaces of quartz and feldspar grow rounded with time. Two suns accelerate this slow chemistry. Grains heat more, fracture sooner, weather faster. Perhaps even their colors shift, carrying two patterns of burn, two memories etched into their silicate lattices. If a geologist's lens examines such grains, it might reveal two overlapping isotopic signatures locked into every fragment, tangles of radiation exposure whispered into the stone. What story would they tell? Confusion, contradiction, or a harmony beyond our comprehension? And so beaches become more than borders of water and land. They become archives spread wide across coasts, each tide rolling over memory, rearranging it, scattering it across new patterns. On our Earth, every beach is already a library of mountains destroyed, a layer of deep time collapsed into shining dust. On a twin-sun Earth, that library glows brighter, louder with its doubled echoes. Perhaps to walk on these beaches would be to hear echoes not with ears, but with eyes, the shimmer of billions of voices refracted in each grain, a chorus written by two luminous parents. But sand does not only belong to beaches. It drifts inland, swept into deserts, rising as dunes over plains. Under two suns, those dunes would shift more quickly, heated and cooled in longer arcs, moving across the land with even greater urgency. Imagine standing in such a desert at midday, light falling from two angles so that every dune casts not one long shadow, but two twin silhouettes sliding in opposite directions. Walking between them would feel like walking between two timelines, two versions of the same silence. Maybe deserts here would feel like ceremonies of duality, spaces where every step confirms the doubling of presence, the estrangement of shadow and self. And yet, what is sand but impermanence? It flows at the slightest push of wind, it scatters at the smallest touch of tide. It exists because stone could not endure eternity. Does this not remind us, softly, that even the greatest mountains collapse into countless echoes? Not because they failed, but because memory itself prefers scattering to stillness. Maybe permanence was never the lesson. Maybe impermanence was always the song the planet wanted to teach. And in these grains, countless, luminous under doubled skies, we glimpse the strange intimacy of cosmic light. Two stars imprint themselves upon stone so small we could lose it in our palm. Yet together those grains outlast us, outlast civilizations, outlast even the maps we draw of coastlines and valleys. They carry the whispers of mountains, the hush of seas, the silence of dawns. Tiny, fragile, yet endless. And yet, if grains of sand can hold such echoes of dual suns, then what of dust, the finer, softer veil drifting through the air, carried across continents by winds, falling over ruins and seas alike? If sand remembers boldly, does dust remember more quietly, as the forgotten wisdom that settles everywhere we stand? If sand remembers boldly, shimmering under light, dust remembers quietly. It is memory that does not need to speak aloud. It is memory that waits. Dust is not absence, though it is easy to mistake it for emptiness. It is the smallest fragment of everything that lived and everything that eroded. The powder of mountains long dissolved, the ash of fires long extinguished, the shells of creatures too small for our eyes buried, crushed, and lifted again into air. Dust is pollen released and left unmapped, bones splintered so fine they pass invisibly beneath our breathing. Each mote, drifting in sunlight, is a fossil, a tiny record of fire, shell, air, and time. And under twin suns, these motes would be multiplied, thickened by the accelerated entropy of a brighter world. More heat, more erosion, more particles freed from stone and from life alike. The very air would shimmer with memory, though to us it might only look hazy, a soft blur between earth and horizon. We think of dust as nuisance, something to wipe away from shelves and windowsills, something to sweep aside from the corners of our rooms. But dust is archive. Every layer that gathers on forgotten objects is a record of what has passed through the air, the minerals of faraway deserts, the soot of distant fires, the pollen of flowers long collapsed outside our doors. Scientists already trace journeys in dust. Iron carried across oceans, feeding plankton blooms. Sahara carried to the Amazon, nourishing forests continents away. In a two-sun Earth, winds would carry even more, brushing entire continents with veils of dust, turning them into scrolls of forgotten history layered grain upon grain. Each sheet of dust a new chapter, though none were ever written. Could it be, then, that civilizations in such a world would vanish more quietly, their remnants not preserved in monuments or fossils, but sifted into dust? Statues worn down faster by doubled brilliance, walls collapsing sooner into grit, inscriptions blurred before anyone could translate them. What remains is dust lifting into the wind, carried on jet streams, scattered far beyond the place of origin, settling even in lands where no one remembers what collapsed. Dust as the ghost of civilizations erased, continuing their story not in ruins but as soft film drifting invisibly across the world. And perhaps there is a wisdom in this, because dust is democratic. It does not preserve kings more carefully than workers, empires more carefully than villages. Everything dissolves into the same pale archive. Dust does not tell us who ruled, who conquered, who was worshipped. It tells us only that something was here, that something lived, decayed, burned, and fell to silence. Maybe this is the deeper truth of memory left behind when too much light erases stone and inscription, that what endures are not names but particles, not stories but whispers. Under twin suns, those whispers would settle everywhere more thickly, more insistently, a constant snowfall of loss that covers equally fields and ruins, seas and cities. Imagine walking through such a landscape, brushing your hand against stone only to lift it and find your palm lined with ancient memory you cannot read, particles of forgotten forests, vanished oceans, burnt civilizations clinging to you without explanation. The air itself heavy with erasure, though you breathe it as though it were only air. And dust, always moving, never stays where it begins. It drifts upward into skies, joins clouds, crosses boundaries of nations, of continents. In the highest reaches of the atmosphere it glows faintly, scattering light, painting sunsets a little deeper red, a little stranger in hue. Perhaps those colors, layered by dust, become the true record of extinction and survival, more accurate than fossils, more forgiving than stone. The skies of a two-sun Earth might glow with perpetual reminders, not just from photons scattering, but from the endless cloud of what has been lost. But dust is not only loss. It feeds oceans, nourishes forests, anchors growth. Out of the smallest losses come cycles of renewal. A handful of dust falling into water, carrying iron, sparking blooms of plankton, filling seas with oxygen again. In such miniature gifts we see that dust is less an ending than a reminder, that everything broken finds its way back, not as monument but as possibility. And yet, if dust itself is archive and renewal, if every breath holds fractured pieces of forgotten epochs, what happens when those fragments meet the ambitions of culture, when civilizations rise again beneath two suns, not with silence, but with myths, temples, and cities reaching upward into perpetual glow? For memory, though fragile, does not remain only in stone or dust. It also writes itself into rituals, stories, and architectures, the living reflections of people trying to bring order into a world that does not pause. Imagine the first humans of this world, stepping into the perpetual glare of dual horizons. What does it mean to tell time in a place where morning is doubled, and shadows never land neatly beneath your feet? Perhaps they do not measure hours as we do. Instead, their calendars might turn on alignments. When the suns draw nearest, when one eclipses the other, when both climb high together, stretching light into a blinding season. Festivals arise not from planting or harvest alone, but from the geometry of fire above, processions built around the sacred crossings of light. Could it be that here, calendars themselves are vast maps of the sky, drawn with double lines, always in negotiation between two truths? Temples, too, would rise beneath perpetual brightness, not facing a single eastern dawn but split between horizons, doorways angled toward both sources, altars catching opposing beams of flame. At midday, when both suns stand together, those altars blaze with twin shadows stretching in opposite directions, an architecture of light more complex than our Earth has ever known. Perhaps entire cities are laid out in patterns of duality. Streets aligned with one sun's rise, monuments with the other. Standing within them, you would never forget that life here answers to two masters, each equally demanding, each equally revered. And myths, those quiet attempts to explain what is greater than us, would tell stories not of a single god of light but of a pair, siblings or lovers, rivaling and embracing, locked in eternal orbit. Maybe their myths do not call light good and darkness evil, as ours often do, but embrace light as double and unstable, truth as layered and plural. A child might grow up with tales of one sun representing memory and the other forgetting, or one binding the body in wakefulness while the other cradles the drifting spirit in soft dream. The myths would not need to be consistent because the sky itself never was. Civilizations in such perpetual glow might themselves inherit this instability. Perhaps they rise swiftly, building magnificent cities, carving calendars into stone, only to fall more quickly, their ruins erased faster by heat, erosion, and storms. Entire cultures might vanish in centuries, remembered only as dust settling into distant lands. But while they lived, their energy might have felt overwhelming. Abundant crops fed by ceaseless daylight, trade routes alive with activity unconstrained by night, work and journeying unbroken by the need for sleep. Could it be that, in such abundance, creativity burned faster, two spirits moving quickly through cycles of invention and collapse? In this imagined world, writing itself might develop differently. Without regular nights to pause and reflect, writing may not be born as long texts, carefully sequenced, but as fragments, inscriptions, patterns, symbols carved in stone to be caught quickly before they fade. Marks made not for continuity but for intensity, flashes of meaning designed to echo like dust through winds long after the people are gone. Whole philosophies may have thrived briefly, then scattered, leaving others to rebuild without ever knowing what was lost. Archaeologists of such a world, if they emerged, would always find puzzles. Few ruins, little stone preserved, no long lineages of monuments. Instead, they would find fragments, broken artifacts, shards of pottery, deposits of dust enriched with isotopes of fire. From these pieces, they would try to imagine the lives of ancestors. How many times might they rediscover the myth of two suns, not realizing that nearly identical civilizations had risen before them, only to collapse into erasure? How many times might history itself be replayed, rewritten, forgotten, then written again? But civilizations are not only shaped by light, they shape themselves in its reflection. Imagine festivals of shadow, where people gather at rare eclipses to witness the only true darkness they will ever know. Imagine rituals of silence, performed at dawn when the world waits between two rising points. Imagine songs composed not in verses, but in overlapping refrains, melodies doubling back on themselves the way two suns fold the world into two versions of the same light. Could entire languages evolve in dualities, their grammar based on pairs, their metaphors always speaking of twos, their conception of identity forever bound to multiplicity? And perhaps identity itself is the greatest question here. Who are we in a world that never grants a singular beginning, a singular light to follow? Maybe civilizations here come to understand themselves differently, not as fixed, not as singular, but as twin selves braided together, just as every shadow they cast splits in two. Not because they chose it, but because the world insisted on it. And yet, if civilizations can rise so brightly only to scatter into dust again, if myths themselves blur and return with each new culture, then what traces would be left of us, not in stone or language, but in something stranger, technological fossils, artifacts of an industry that endures beyond our bodies? What fingerprints might human creation leave behind, locked into the earth beneath double suns? For when civilizations collapse, they leave more than broken temples. They leave fingerprints that do not belong to life or to myth, marks pressed into the geology itself. Technofossils, the relics of industry and invention, silent fragments of machines scattered deep into the soil. Imagine, in a two-sun world, how such relics might differ. Plastics, the artificial shells we scatter freely, would soften faster under ceaseless brightness, bleaching, fracturing, curling into brittle shards beneath twin skies. Yet when buried, far from the glare, they might last even longer, pressed into sediment as strange, glossy seams that no creature before us could ever have left. Glass, too, could endure, sand reborn through fire, cooled into clarity, re-entering stone not as nature made it, but as we insisted it should be. Alloys, steels, metals, all eroding differently under endless heat, their structures altered by twofold sunlight, their surfaces pitted and scarred more quickly, but their dense cores lingering, fusing into rock strata, forever testifying. We were here, and we shaped this place. On Earth as we know it, there is already debate. Will our artifacts last millions of years? Could distant scientists, alien or future, read our epic in geology the way we read trilobites and ammonites in stone? Perhaps yes. Plastics forming new composites, concrete solidifying into mineral layers, isotopes from nuclear fires marking the mid-20th century as a permanent horizon. In a binary sun-Earth, these technofossils would be stranger still. Radiation would etch their chemistry differently, bleaching isotopic balances, distorting the decay trails that now serve as clocks of time. A shard of plastic, buried in clay, might hum faintly with the memory of two suns' exposure, a silent twin-burn signature etched into its molecules. Could it be that such fossils would stand out even more distinctly, their unnatural nature sharpened by the peculiar rhythms of dual fire? Where bones might dissolve before burial, where forests might collapse without inscription, our artifacts could remain, fragile but legible, like graffiti in stone. Civilization erased in story, erased in dust, but still inscribed in seams of polymer and alloy preserved by accident. Perhaps technofossils become the only clear record in a world where natural fossils rarely survive. Is it not possible, then, that human legacy is not myth, not architecture, but garbage transfigured into time's archive? This thought carries both humility and awe, for technofossils are not elegant. They are fragments of tires, of packaging, of glass bottles, of reinforced concrete, of microchips crushed into sand. Yet when pressed into sediment, carried into subduction, layered into mountains that will rise in far distant ages, they whisper across millions of years. Once, there was a species that remade matter. Not because it worshipped permanence, but because it could. Our inventions may become the clearest language the planet will recite long after everything else has blurred. And there is silence in this too, a silence we rarely consider, because technofossils are not chosen. We do not select them as legacy. They are left behind without intention, without ceremony. They do not tell our myths, our languages, our loves. They tell only of our materials, our chemistry, our reach into the earth and sky. Could the memory of a people be reduced to chemical residue, to layered plastic seams and metallic oxides? Maybe, and maybe that is its own poetry. A reminder that our truest memory may not be what we hoped to preserve, but what we forgot to hide. Geology depends on forgetting. It layers over itself again and again. Oceans carry fragments of us to their deep floors, pushing them under through subduction zones, recycling them into magma, exhaling them later through volcanoes. Imagine, then, our technofossils caught in this vast loop. A bottle fragment carried under continents, melted into magma, released again in cooled lava on the flank of a new mountain. A microchip fragment fused into obsidian. A steel nail entombed in granite after 1 billion years of burial. What kind of memory is this? Not one of clarity, but of persistence. The memory of matter changed, reborn, scattered, and enduring in ways we never asked for. And so, under two suns, the quiet museum of the future may not be temples or scripts, not myths or calendars, but sediments streaked with accidental relics. Strange seams of human matter, glowing faintly with isotopic twins, waiting to be uncovered eons later by inquisitive eyes. Those eyes may not belong to us. They may not even belong to our descendants. But someone or something would read them and wonder what kind of beings left behind such artifacts. Was it possible they reached further than their frail bodies allowed? Was it possible they saw themselves enduring not in flesh or in story, but in stone transfigured by invention? And yet, if geology can hold even the fragments of our inventions, if two suns can press human fingerprints into stone longer than bone or story survives, then perhaps we must ask, what of rivers, the planet's restless blood, flowing constantly across land? If technofossils are buried, rivers help both to scatter and reveal them. Perhaps flowing time itself is best mirrored in water, carving new paths even as it carries memory away. They do not bury artifacts as stone does. They do not settle memory as dust does. They carry, they scatter, they speak in movement. Rivers are liquid time, flowing archives that never stay still, shaping landscapes even as they erase them, announcing change even as they dissolve its traces. On our Earth, rivers follow rhythm. Rain falls, snow melts, glaciers release their hidden waters, and streams braid downward, finding valleys, finding seas. Their cycles are dependable, drawn by the pull of seasons and the patient tilt of orbit. But beneath two suns, that rhythm would falter, pulling wider, stranger arcs. Evaporation would stretch higher into air. Storms would come faster and heavier. Rain would fall not in steady pulses but in sudden floods, abrupt and uncertain. Rivers here would not be creatures of routine. They would be improvisers, redrawing channels year upon year, deserts one moment, deluge the next. Imagine standing by such a river, in its brief moment of calm. Its surface glows doubly, catching twin reflections of suns above, a shimmering lattice of light dancing and breaking across the current. Yet beneath that brightness runs menace and promise both. A restless knowing that soon rains will return, or soon the channel will dry to exposed stone. Perhaps the very definition of river would grow unstable here, some existing not as permanent bodies, but as flickering phenomena, appearing, vanishing, then appearing again. Could it be, then, that entire civilizations would grow cautious of rivers, revering them not only as life-givers but as oracles of instability? Geology feels the work of rivers most deeply. Mountains lose themselves first to rivulets, then to streams, then to rivers that carve valleys wider with every century. In a world of perpetual day, these valleys would deepen faster. Floods would wash more sediment into the sea, carving sharp gorges in years where it once took centuries. Lakes would bloom and then vanish as rivers changed their courses, capturing one basin and abandoning another. To read such geology would be to read a script in motion, to attempt to archive that which refuses to hold still. Would deep time itself feel shorter here, rivers collapsing more quickly into seas that rise and fall too often to keep memory stable? Perhaps what we call epochs on Earth might shrink into mere chapters under twin suns, accelerated rivers compressing events into shorter geological breaths. And rivers are more than water. They are voices, restless ones, carrying whispers of everything they touch. Minerals dissolve into their flow, isotopes tracing whether glaciers fed them, whether storms thickened them, whether heat thinned their bodies into slow trickles. A geologist testing these waters would find stories etched into their chemistry. The exact angle of the suns at their headwaters, the rainfall cycles dragged by their light, even the ash of civilizations eroded into their flow. Could it be, then, that rivers are not only time but testimony, each one broadcasting silently the history of a shifting earth? But perhaps more than geology, it is memory that rivers shape. On our Earth, cultures rise along their banks, defining themselves by their flow, the Nile, the Indus, the Tigris, the Amazon. Rituals, myths, and languages carve themselves into the shape of the waters. In a two-sun Earth, those cultures would not find comfort in steady cycles. Their myths might speak instead of rivers as illusions, as fleeting spirits who grant life one year and death the next. Children might be taught not to trust rivers but to honor their changes, their disappearances, their bright returns. Perhaps entire calendars would be built not around agriculture alone, but around the rare relenting of rivers, moments when their fury softened enough to allow gardens to grow. And yet, rivers are also mirrors. Just as skies scatter light into color, just as dust records absence across continents, Rivers reflect the condition of the land itself. Their silence or their surging is a mirror of climate's instability. Could it be that rivers on such a world are the truest clocks, their shifting voices echoing the unstable heartbeat of a double-sun Earth? They mark time not by ticking, but by carving, not by counting, but by carrying. And in their carrying there is prophecy. For rivers of this kind would wear away not only mountains, but also glaciers, ancient reservoirs of light folded into ice. If rivers are liquid time, then glaciers are frozen memory. And when rivers rush hungrily across perennial ice, pulling it faster to the sea, they unravel that memory more swiftly than we expect. So we must ask, what happens when the archives of ice begin to retreat under twin suns, leaving us with rivers richer in water but emptier in memory? If rivers are liquid time, then glaciers are frozen memory. They do not rush and scatter. They hold. They accumulate snowfall year after year, compressing it into layers that preserve the faintest whispers of atmosphere, the smallest traces of climate, the forgotten breaths of epochs. Each band of ice is a diary, thin but legible, a record of air, dust, and sunlight from moments tens of thousands of years past. But under the glare of two suns, what chance does such patience have? If glaciers existed at all in such a world, they would be frail, stubborn outposts of silence against the constant fire of the skies. Forming on the highest peaks, at the furthest poles where dual brilliance weakens, they would seem more fragile than eternal. Twin suns would sculpt ice differently. Not steady accumulations, not stoic walls of crystal, but restless masks of frozen light. Melting, reforming, vanishing, beginning again. Glaciers would survive in fits, as if breathing unevenly, growing in the rare shadows of mountains or under cloudbursts that bring sudden torrents of snow, then shrinking almost immediately when skies clear. And yet those fleeting bodies of ice would still matter, because they alone could hold two solar signatures in silence. Ice cores, delicate cylinders drilled deep into frozen sheets, reveal our Earth's rhythm of ages. Carbon levels, volcanic ash, ancient winds preserved as bubbles of air. But a two-sun Earth would write a stranger script. Successive layers might trap isotopes carrying alternating fingerprints, oxygen ratios swinging under doubled heat, sulfur folding in from volcanic smog altered by two traces of radiance, hydrogen shifting subtly, reflecting cycles we could not cleanly unravel. Could we even read such cores clearly, or would they confuse us endlessly, like layered languages bleeding into each other? Perhaps they would not be legible in the way we hope, but more like music, two melodies overlaid into dissonance, requiring ears willing to hear harmony where others hear only noise. But glaciers are not only records, they are sculptors. They grind rock under their weight, polishing valleys, carrying boulders hundreds of miles before setting them down out of place like forgotten pieces of another world. Even fleeting glaciers would carve, yet their carving too would change under two suns. Melting more quickly, their valleys would be shallower, their moraines shorter-lived. Landscapes would be marked not by grand epics of frozen dominance but by flickering scars. Gullies half-excavated, polished stones already softened into erosion before centuries could pass. The geology of ice would become stuttered, like handwriting interrupted, lines written and erased, never stretching long enough to form whole paragraphs of time. For those who might live in the presence of such ice, glaciers would feel even more sacred for their fragility. They would be the last shelters of night, places where light reflects not fiercely but dimly, where faint cold blue seeps into silence. Standing near one would feel like touching memory itself, the closest one could find to pause, to stillness, to shadow. And perhaps that is why people dwelling in the reach of two suns might travel to glaciers as pilgrims, not simply for water but for wisdom, for fragments of a world still willing to keep secrets. Maybe each rare piece of surviving glacier would be revered as a cathedral of memory, ancient despite its fragility, vast because of what it carries in silence. But glaciers also vanish silently. Their retreats are not sudden explosions, but drawn-out sighs, centuries of shrinking, meters of loss each year, until they are not there at all. Under twin suns, that sigh becomes more urgent. Whole glaciers could rise and vanish in only lifespans, their records lost before anyone drills, their silence erased before anyone listens. This is perhaps the greatest sorrow of glaciers in a dual-sun world. Not only that they retreat more quickly, but that their wisdom dissolves before it can be passed on. How many ages of atmosphere, how many delicate signatures of shifting climate would we never see, because fire touched ice too harshly? Entropy wears many cloaks, but in glaciers it wears white. White that recedes. White that vanishes into rivers hungry to carry it away. Perhaps this vanishing speaks to us more softly than destruction by flame, and yet it says the same thing, that memory cannot hold against too much light. That loss often comes not loudly, but quietly, each layer of ice erased almost before it knew it was there. And yet, if glaciers retreat, if their silence escapes and flows into rushing rivers, what then of the spaces they leave behind? Valleys hollowed, caverns opened, mineral chambers exposed, stalactites beginning their patient growth in the absence of eternal light? If ice is memory dissolved, then caves may be the next keepers of time, holding in their crystalline whispers a geology of two suns in a darkness of their own. Valleys are hollowed, caverns are opened, mineral chambers revealed, dripping in secrecy where ice has surrendered. Here, in the hidden interiors of Earth, a different kind of memory takes hold, one that does not race with the suns but trickles slowly, patiently, as though the planet itself were writing in whispers. Caves are slow readers of geology. They build not from sudden motion but from tiny drops of water carrying minerals, layer by careful layer, year after year. Entering one is like stepping into the Earth's double memory, where every stalactite grows like an icicle of stone, every stalagmite rises like a buried flame of time, and every crystal face is a page of geology turned too slowly for us to notice. In a world of twin suns, where rivers rush harder and ice dissolves quicker, caves become even more precious. Places where slowness and silence defy the brightness outside. And yet, even here the suns leave their marks. Minerals that drip from ceilings, calcium packed within thin veils of water, arrive altered by the cycles of dual skies. Their composition records carbon and oxygen from air scrubbed differently by double radiance, two solar patterns written into each band of calcite. Just as tree rings whisper of rain and drought, stalagmites whisper of atmosphere, of light, of subtle shifts. A cave in such a world would hold not only darkness, but glimmers of twin horizons locked into crystals, glowing softly if touched by flame or lantern. Could we not say, then, that caves are libraries, each droplet of calcite a letter, each towering column a sentence written across thousands of years? Imagine holding a thin cross-section of stalagmite daylight for study, its stripes barely visible to the eye. On one layer, the isotopes reveal a cooler interval when one sun's orbit shifted behind the other. On the next, ratios blur as two flames overlap, drawing heat deeper, altering rainfall, reshaping rivers. To us, the patterns might seem chaotic, unclear, but to the cave they are steady, etchings of balance and imbalance, patient acceptance of a sky that never stopped moving. Caves do not resist, they record. Stepping into such depths, one feels a paradox. Above, light rules, twin suns scouring every surface, erasing quickly what tries to stand. But below, light recedes. Dripping echoes take prominence, mineral fingers slowly reaching down to greet their counterparts rising up. A marriage of stone in darkness. In this hush, we sense perhaps the most profound truth, that memory does not belong only to light. It belongs equally to shadow, equally to silence. Could it be that the earth itself desires both, one to scorch and one to cradle, one to erase and one to remember? In some caves, crystals bloom into chambers, walls dazzling if touched by even the briefest glow, quartz and calcite scattering light into gems. In a double-sun world, these formations would sparkle differently, inscriptions of two lights taught into their very lattice. To walk there would be to see stars beneath the ground, constellations made of minerals instead of gases, secret skies mirroring the heavens above but twinned again, as if Earth itself refused to forget the duality shining above. But caves are not untouched. Entropy seeps into them too. Columns break, ceilings collapse, underground rivers shift their course, abandoning galleries they once flooded, leaving behind dry scars of what was. Whole passages may vanish beneath rockfall, their libraries sealed, unreadable forever. Yet even in collapse, caves transform, reminding us that silence too can fracture, that memory is never absolute. Perhaps that is why we find them so haunting, because they are both guardians of time and confessors of its fragility. And perhaps caves, more than any other archive, remind us of something more unsettling, that the deepest memories we seek to preserve are not always meant for us. They remain buried, sacred, unshared, until accident or curiosity trespasses upon them. In this sense, caves embody the humility of time, holding patiently but never promising that humans will read what they store. Maybe most of their wisdom is fated to stay sealed forever. And yet, if caves can gather droplets of mineral into chronicles of forever, if they can hold dual lights frozen into silent crystals, then what of bones? What of the fragile scaffolds of creatures like us, left to bleach or bury beneath perpetual suns? If stone remembers, and caves remember, then how do bones, so delicate, so fleeting, attempt to leave their whisper behind? Bones are not monuments. They are compromises between strength and vulnerability, built to bear weight and movement, yet soft enough to dissolve. They are scaffolds of calcium, lattices of fragile chemistry that, once abandoned by living flesh, begin to erode immediately. On our Earth, some bones find refuge in quick burial, pressed by silt, sheltered from erosion until time and mineral transform them into fossils. But under the doubled heat of two suns, burial is not certain. Erosion insists harder, scavengers work quicker, microbial decay deepens. Bones left exposed bleach faster, crack sooner, crumble to dust before sediment ever embraces them. This thought softens the certainty of legacy. If fossils on our Earth are already rare, miraculous survivors of deep time, then in a two-sun Earth the rarity doubles. Life would bloom, but its skeletal traces may hardly endure. Entire ages of creatures might rise and vanish without leaving fossils for future eyes. Entire histories of beings could go unfelt, their existences erased by the twin brilliance overhead. Could it be, then, that under perpetual sun's memory becomes even more fragile, even more silence than inscription? That bones are reminders not of permanence, but of disappearance? And yet, the fossils that endure would be profound treasures. A single preserved skeleton would whisper not just of death, but of the forces it resisted to stay whole, the burning skies, the relentless weather, the wider erasure. Each bone turned to stone would become more than evidence of biology. It would be proof that memory can withstand even overwhelming odds. Perhaps paleontologists of such a world would be less excavators than listeners, reverent to each fragment, each tooth, each vertebra carrying the burden of histories otherwise erased. We might imagine walking through a plain where countless creatures once roamed, knowing intuitively that their lives left little trace beneath the soil. No fossils wait for us here, only the empty certainty that they once stood. It is humbling to think that the land has held so much without preserving it, that what survives in stone is not the full chorus of life, but rare echoes, that fossils are not history entire, but faint whispers of it. Maybe this is why bones, when found, feel sacred, not because they are grand, but because they survived forgetting. In deep time, bones become translators, carrying isotopes within them that tell of diet, of waters drunk, of air breathed before death. On our Earth, we study the ratios of carbon and oxygen in enamel, finding records of rainfall, of climate shifts. In a world of two suns, these isotopic whispers would carry layered rhythms, twin records of atmosphere and heat. A fossilized bone might recall not only a body's existence, but also the very balance of skies above it, the kind of light it carried inside itself without ever realizing. Could it be that bones are less about the dead than they are about the suns, about the unknowing chorus of all creatures carrying starlight in silence? And bones are not always buried. Many remain at the surface, fragments scattered, bleaching white in the gaze of perpetual light. To stumble upon them is to glimpse absence, to see the lingering truth of mortality written on open ground. And yet, even this bleaching carries its own meaning. Under twin suns, the brightness would intensify, whitening bone into fragile ash more quickly, scattering it like chalk returned to wind and dust. Could it be that bleaching itself is also a form of inscription? Bones becoming so pale against the land that they teach a lesson, if only briefly, about the urgency of life's impermanence? Perhaps, then, bones speak less as permanent records and more as temporary choruses. Their long echo is not an unbroken one. It is stuttered, often silenced, sometimes pressed into rock, sometimes erased into dust. They remind us that no memory is guaranteed, that loss is not failure but truth. Entropy reaches even here, scattering calcium, scattering structure, folding life back into earth. And maybe this very fragility is the lesson, that bones whisper not because they last, but because they fade. And yet, if bones, so fragile, struggle to speak under twin suns, then perhaps the voice of the earth shifts deeper, turning to fire. For beyond erosion and burial lies something wilder. Volcanoes, rising not with silence, but with eruptions that rewrite the land beneath perpetual day. If bones are fragile echoes of memory, volcanoes are memory made molten and alive. If bones are fragile echoes, fading quickly under twin suns, then perhaps the voice of the earth shifts deeper, into fire. For beneath all erosion and erasure, beneath the rivers rushing and the glaciers sighing away, lies the mantle immense, hot, restless. Here, memory is not brittle calcium or fragile sediment, but molten stone. And when this memory rises, it does so not silently but with eruptions, volcanoes breathing out the hidden history of the planet's interior. Volcanoes are reminders that the Earth is alive, its surface not static but restless skin stretched over a ceaseless ocean of molten stone. Each eruption is a fragment of ancient interior, brought upward, cooled into rock that later becomes mountain, later becomes dust. In our world, volcanism is guided by subduction, by the slow collisions and drifts of plates pressing crust into mantle. But under two suns, tectonics might be more restless. Extrasolar heat pressing into the oceans shifts currents, shifts circulation, shifts the balance of weight across plates. Ice, diminished or gone, presses less upon valleys. Seas, swollen with evaporation, weigh differently upon the crust. The earth, already never still, finds itself less stable still, pulled into even more frequent adjustments. It is easy to imagine, then, that volcanoes in such a world might flourish widely, their voices louder, their breaths more constant. Each outpouring of lava would carry with it the story of both suns, inner heat reflecting outer brilliance. Imagine this. Standing before a lava flow, watching its surface glow red and orange, but under dual skies those colors grow deeper still, molten stone shimmering with the reflection of two suns upon its skin. A fire within, recalling the earliest days of planetary birth, and fires above, reminding of the endless gaze of the stars. Volcano and sky answering each other in heat, in brilliance, in persistence. Volcanoes, too, are timekeepers. Lava hardens to basalt, trapping magnetic orientation, recording the Earth's field at the instant of its cooling. Ash falls, scattering isotopes that can be read eons later. Gases released whisper of deep carbon cycles, of oxygen drawn or given, of life altered suddenly by suffocating skies. Under double suns, these records might shift strangely. More carbon in circulation, altered oxygen from stressed forests and oceans, atmospheres receiving volcanic outbursts that interact differently with overlapping light. Could it be that volcanic air would create skies not only stained dark, but shimmering with strange halos, two suns refracted in veils of volcanic ash? Perhaps even sunsets would hold double scars, reminders of eruptions stitched into every horizon. And yet volcanoes are also metaphor. They embody entropy in reverse, chaos brought not by dissolution but by emergence. Entire islands rise from underwater vents, newborn land arriving where yesterday there was only sea. Entire cities can be erased, buried under flows that turn thriving life into silence. Memory here is paradox. Volcanic rock preserves isotopes like diaries of the mantle, But eruption also burns archives, melts fossils, buries rivers, erases landscapes. Could it be that memory is always double, always both created and destroyed in the same moment? That every eruption is an act of remembrance and forgetting together? Cultures living within this glare of two suns might build entire mythologies around volcanoes, seeing them not only as destructive but as sacred mouths of the earth. Temples could rise upon cooled basalt, altars placed where the planet once exhaled its deepest breath. Songs may speak of fire not just as the punishment of gods but as their gift, the truth that all things, body and stone, eventually melt back into unity, into silence. Perhaps volcanoes would remind us, again and again, that stability is temporary, that beneath our cities, beneath our roads, beneath all the forgotten bones, the earth waits, and it remembers in fire. Science tells us that volcanic layers record epochs. Each hardened flow, each deposit of ash, is a page in the diary of deep time. Across millions of years, stacks of these layers write the story of Earth's restlessness. But in a two-sun Earth, the layers might be denser, shorter cycles pressing event upon event, compressing history into thick, hurried archives. Future geologists might stand within canyon walls of stacked basalt, counting not thousands but tens of thousands of eruptions per epoch, overwhelmed by the Earth's memory written too insistently, too tirelessly. Could one even read such pages? Or would it feel like trying to hear a chorus sung too loud to separate its voices? Perhaps that is the lesson of volcanoes under eternal day, that memory is not always gentle, not always delicate like dust or bones, but can also roar, scatter, ignite. And still, the roar fades too, cooling into silence, flows hardening into brittle stone, ash settling into soil. Memory becomes immovable but fragile to wind and water again. The circle is unbroken. And yet, if fire rising from Earth's depths can reflect two suns upon its molten skin, if even eruption itself can become record, then what of the life compelled to grow in this brilliance? If rivers, ice, caves, and bones all dissolve, if even fire cools into remembering stone, how do creatures themselves adapt, bloom, and transform beneath a glow that never fades? If rivers, caves, glaciers, and bones all dissolve, if even fire cools into still stone, how do creatures adapt when the very sky refuses to dim? Evolution bends to its environment, and under perpetual brightness, it would curve differently, shaping forms both familiar and strange. Life sculpted by endless light. On our world, light is rhythm. Most creatures rest when it retreats, flourish when it returns. Eyes are built with limits, pupils that narrow in day and widen at night, retinas tuned for contrasts. But under twin suns, rhythm dissolves. There is no genuine night, no deep relief from brightness, only a shifting overlap of brilliance. Eyes here would adapt not for scarcity but for excess. Layers of pigment might line retinas, filtering radiance, pulling shadows out from glare. Pupils could split or shudder, closing into slits so fine that the unbearable becomes visible. Maybe creatures here would see wavelengths beyond our range, perceiving hues invisible to us, reminding them where one sun dominates and the other softens. Skins, too, would change. On Earth, pigment protects against sunlight, melanin shielding DNA from its unraveling force. In a world of double suns, this pressure intensifies. Skin might grow thicker, scales layered with reflective crystallization like sunlit armor, or pelts shimmering with iridescent hues to scatter rays. Forest animals could gleam like liquid metal, reflecting heat to survive. Desert wanderers could adopt pale translucence, diffusing radiance rather than absorbing it. Here, survival would not be about hiding from light, but about learning to live as an expression of it. Could it be that creatures themselves would glitter, walking memories of suns, not only living under them but wearing them? Metabolisms would race faster, too. Energy from relentless daylight would quicken ecosystems, driving photosynthetic organisms to bloom constantly, fueling chains of abundance that burn out just as quickly. Predators might grow leaner, sharper, moving at higher speeds to match prey that reproduces with relentless urgency. Insects might exist in staggering cycles, entire hives alive, buzzing bright, then collapsing, replaced by another, each generation adapting fractionally to heat and brightness. Could intelligence itself accelerate in such a churn, or would it fragment, unable to hold memory long enough to stabilize? Maybe both: bursts of brilliance, then forgetting, then brilliance again. But evolution is not only shaped by pressure. It is shaped by rhythms of extinction and survival, by deep time repeating its cycles. Under twin suns, species might rarely find rest. Ecologies could expand into wild, diverse adaptations, then retreat suddenly when climates shift or heat intensifies. Entire families of creatures might exist for only a short span, leaving almost no fossils to speak for them once they vanish. The record of their existence may be written only in DNA fragments borrowed by successors, strands carried forward like ghosts encoded into living forms. If we traced such genes, might we find constant reminders of beauty long lost, strands of forgotten wings, pigments of vanished skins, metabolized memories of creatures never fossilized? And yet, for all this impermanence, life would still speak its resilience. Perhaps in oceans, where water softens the unforgiving light, new reefs might glow with organisms forged for dual radiance, polyps blossoming like mirrored suns themselves. In caves, albino strains of life might evolve differently, not as escapees from light, but as creatures thriving between its doubled reflections, feeding on mineral whispers still glowing faint. On plains, herds might travel ceaselessly, their migrations not seasonal but perpetual, following shifting heat cycles as though chasing balance that never arrives. And through all of this, questions echo. Would intelligence emerge here? Could a species evolve eyes sharp enough, minds elastic enough, to thrive in such instability? And if so, what stories would they tell of their skies? Perhaps myths of perpetual ancestors, beings of light always above, never retreating. Perhaps identities formed not of singular selfhood, but of doubling, of dual perception. Maybe they would not even conceive of individuality as we do, but see themselves as reflections, twin echoes of the suns they live beneath. Perhaps, then, the lesson of species under endless light is humility, that life, for all its resilience, bends to conditions far larger than itself. Just as rivers mirror climates, as caves write atmospheres in crystal, so life too carries the imprint of its sky. Skins, bones, wings, and eyes become archives, no less important than stone or dust. They whisper, "We were here, and we lived under a glow that never dimmed." And yet, if life itself can be reshaped so thoroughly by perpetual light, if entire species bloom and vanish without rest, then what of silence? What of the rare places and moments where no sound, no movement, no rhythm intrudes? Could silence become more precious in a world always lit? An echo not of light, but of its absence? What of the stillness that is neither body nor stone, but the space between, those brief and fragile interludes when the world rests? Amid so much brilliance, silence becomes more precious than ever, more elusive, more sacred. For if there is no shadow to offer refuge, then where does stillness hide? And what does it mean for us to remember what it feels like? On our earth, silence often arrives with dusk. The day softens, wings fold, crickets begin their low music, and villages grow quiet as stars appear. Night offers the body respite, and with it comes a hush as familiar as breath. But under two suns, night never falls cleanly. The hush of darkness is never assured. Silence becomes fractured, interrupted by the ongoing activity of creatures that never learn to tire, by winds that never fully rest, by an atmosphere still leaning beneath constant heat. Perhaps silence here must be sought, not found. Perhaps it exists only in rare fissures, like dew in a desert, transient, precious, dissolving almost the instant it appears. Where, then, would silence remain? Perhaps in the deepest caves, where the voice of dripping water speaks louder than the suns outside. Perhaps in the farthest valleys, shadowed by mountain flanks that do not let light enter whole. Perhaps in the ocean's lower reaches, where sound moves differently, where the weight of water muffles brightness into something gentler. Is it possible that in such a world, silence would not be a daily rhythm but a pilgrimage, something to be journeyed toward, something to treasure when found? And silence itself might alter perception. Without it, memory frays. Without pause, time runs too quickly, merging moments into an endless ribbon. It is silence that divides experience, silence that frames thought. Remove it, and maybe thought itself becomes restless, identities blurring into continuous wakefulness. Could we even be ourselves without stillness? Or would we scatter like dust into light, fragments without anchor? Amid so much glow, silence may also be confused with emptiness. Yet there is a difference. Emptiness feels barren. Silence feels full. Full of withheld memory, full of echoes still circling inward. In our own skies at real night, when stars appear, silence stretches outward in a way that makes us feel both tiny and infinite. Under a two-sun earth, stars would seldom reveal themselves, too dim against dual fire. The silence between stars becomes not nightly but rare, appearing in faint moments when eclipses overlap or thin veils of dust scatter enough brilliance to uncover the deeper sky. Imagine civilizations waiting for such times, gathering together when both suns hide briefly, to look upward at a universe they can almost never see. Perhaps for them silence is not only on Earth, but stretched across the heavens, the grandeur of stars remembered rarely, as if they are secrets told only in whispers. And what ceremonies would grow from this? Maybe there would be long songs of silence, prayers spoken only through pauses, rituals structured not upon words but upon listening. Perhaps even philosophy itself grows differently here, not obsessed with discovery, but with intervals, with asking not what is gained through noise, but what is revealed when the glow dims, however briefly. Could silence itself be elevated into myth, personified as a missing god, one who hides but never abandons? Entropy even here claims silence. Winds intrude, flows resume, animals stir. Stillness breaks quickly, fading like fossilized air bubbles collapsing in old ice. Yet perhaps that impermanence is what makes silence matter most, that it cannot be stored, cannot be archived, cannot be studied in isotope or stone. It exists only by being experienced. Maybe silence is the most fragile memory of all, the one that survives not in the earth, not in archives or fossils, but only in us, in moments when listening becomes more powerful than speaking. And yet, if silence is so rare, so fleeting, then what happens to memory itself, when one sun can pass in front of the other? When sudden eclipses draw shadows across the land, cutting interruptions into endless day, those brief eclipses become holy, pauses written into the sky itself. Perhaps in those obscured moments, memory awakens, cultures gather, and the world reclaims for a moment the stillness it had thought forever lost. For in a world of perpetual brightness, the only true shadows would be born not from mountain or valley, not from forests or clouds, but from the suns themselves crossing paths. Sometimes one would drift across the other, veiling it for a breath of time, throwing fleeting eclipses across the land. These moments, sacred and brief, become pauses inscribed not by us but by the sky, reminders of a night that otherwise never comes. On our earth, an eclipse is astonishing but temporary. The sun darkens, the corona blazes, and then it is over, the world returning quickly to ordinary rhythm. But in a dual sun-earth, eclipses would carry deeper gravity. For under two horizons of perpetual fire, only when their paths aligned could light diminish enough for land to feel relief. Imagine the hush when both suns overlap in silence, when their blaze recedes briefly into shadow. The landscape darkens not fully, but enough for stars to flicker shyly into view, enough for the air to cool in a way forgotten by most days. For creatures evolved in ceaseless brightness, such eclipses might feel like dreams made momentarily real. Civilizations living here would treasure them as holy intervals. Temples might be built not toward east or west but toward the path of alignment, great stones placed in anticipation of these rare gatherings of shadow. Calendars might not measure months or even years, but the cycles of eclipses, centuries charted by when the heavens granted their briefest stillness. Festivals bloom around them, songs sung not of harvests or storms, but of stars revealed for minutes, of shadows rare enough to be worshipped. Could it be that entire cosmologies arose from these moments of reprieve? Light equated with chaos, shadow with unity, both eternally necessary as brothers or sisters embracing only a few times in each age. Memory itself may feel restored by these eclipses. Without shadow, the mind blurs, hours run together, reflection falters. But when eclipses arrive, they carve interruption into time, and in that interruption, memory anchors itself. People might recount moments of past eclipses, speaking of where they stood, who they were with, what the world looked like when perpetual light relented. These memories would bind civilization, repeating from one generation to the next. I was there when the suns became one. Perhaps, in a strange way, eclipses become the only true clocks of such a world, time measured not by days that never differ, but by the rare pauses that cut through eternal sameness. Geology, too, would remember. Dust settling during eclipses, cooled air slowing wind, isotopic ratios shifting ever so slightly in sudden dips of temperature. Tiny differences, recorded in ice or stone, subtle markers of these transient pauses. Imagine a future geologist drilling into stalagmite or core, finding faint, unusual bands, cooling and thickening signals out of place. Eclipses would hide within the very chemistry of Earth, rare signatures of respite embedded permanently in mineral diaries. Even the planet itself would remember. But eclipses are not just pauses, they are metaphors. They teach that shadow survives even where light insists louder. They remind us that nothing is absolute, that even suns can obscure one another, that duality is not permanence but balance, a dance of concealment as much as of illumination. Could it be that civilizations on this earth would build identities around this teaching, that forgetting, like shadow, is not loss but reprieve, that sometimes to pause memory is to preserve it more deeply? We imagine crowds under those skies, gathered in fields and mountains, watching as one radiant disk dims the other, feeling for the first time in years, or perhaps lifetimes, the cool brush of twilight. There would be awe but not fear, quiet but not emptiness. In those instants, civilizations would feel connected, each eclipse remembered not just as shadow on land, but as collective breath, shared silence, a memory eclipsing even light itself. And yet, if eclipses return shadow to us for only a moment, if they are sacred for their rarity, what does that mean for who we are? How does identity shape itself when born in two lights, then briefly shown what it feels like to stand in the hush of one? Who are we if the very rhythm of our lives is doubled? Not one rising sun, but two, not one memory of dawn, but two overlapping. Do we remain singular, or do we become dual in perception, carrying more than one self within us, each echoing a different light? On our earth, identity leans upon rhythm. We divide ourselves in segments, before and after, day and night, past and future. Light gives structure and shadow affirms it. But in a world with two suns, such divisions blur. The hours no longer arrive as neatly partitioned brackets of experience. Time spills forward without obvious breaks, and we too spill into it. Perhaps in such a world, the idea of self would not be one line moving forward, but two braided currents, twining and untwining, confusing even memory. Could it be that perception itself would grow dual, each light fostering its own version of us? One self that wakes beneath the first sun, not fully, not complete, and another that sharpens when the second flame crests? Two selves that meet, overlap, and separate again within us, ceaselessly. Psychology here would not speak of singular identity but of layered perception. Dreams might not fall into simple sequences but echo with double horizons. A person might feel one truth burn into them with the earlier rising, and another later in the cycle, so that recollection itself becomes doubled. Who was I this morning? One might ask quietly. And who am I now, beneath the second sun? Both answers would be true, even if they contradicted one another. Maybe living here means being two at once, weaving between light without ever fully reconciling it. It is worth wondering how civilization would answer such duality. Would myths explain each human as born not with a single soul, but with two, each loyal to a different star? Would rituals acknowledge both selves, naming them separately, giving each sun its own offerings? Perhaps calendars mark twin days, one belonging to the first light, one to the second, so that people live layered existences, acknowledged in alternating cycles. Could entire philosophies here be dedicated not to unifying the self but honoring its multiplicity? The recognition that contradiction is not weakness but nature, that holding two truths at once is survival. Biology might even support such splitting. Circadian cycles fractured under perpetual brightness could reinforce dual selves, body chemistries surging in overlapping waves, melatonin never fully falling, cortisol never fully fading. We might not sleep as neatly, nor wake as completely. Half wakefulness aligning with one sun, half alertness with another. Perhaps individuals would cultivate dual habits. Two kinds of productivity, two different moods, two sets of stories told according to which light touched them. We would be single bodies, but within, the twin fire would carry us as shifting companions of ourselves. And memory, too, would fracture. If day never ends, if events unfold in ceaseless glow, when does one memory give way to another? It may be the suns themselves who divide them, sun 1 marking one kind of recall, sun 2 marking another. Entire histories might be remembered in layers, parallel traditions preserved but never blended, each tethered to different cycles of light. In archaeology, one might find not singular stories but pairs, two interpretations of the same event, two truths etched upon stone. Which sun warmed that day, the people would ask, and in answering, they would anchor memory differently. But such a dual self need not weaken identity. It may expand it. To be two is not necessarily to be fractured. It can also be to be multiplied. Perhaps in such a world contradiction itself becomes natural comfort. Identity flowing instead of fixed. Humans accepting that truth is not sharp-edged but layered like shadows falling in two directions. Could it be that dual suns teach us the humility of plurality, that we are not singular flames but twin echoes forever reaching to reconcile themselves? And yet, if identity itself becomes twofold, if memory and perception are doubled, then what about time? For time is the scaffold beneath identity, the silent measure in which selfhood unfolds. If light itself twists our perception, how would the clocks of such a world measure what we are? Would time itself become built upon shadows, not seconds, shadows bending in two directions at once? For time is the scaffold beneath identity, and all our rituals of becoming, of remembering, of living are written upon it. Our measurement of time has always leaned on night and day, on the certainty of darkness returning to soften light. But in a world where darkness never comes fully, where two suns chase each other across the heavens, clocks may have been born of something else. Not hours, not nights, but shadows, shadows weaving in two directions, spaces in between, crossings of light marking the passage of existence. On our earth, shadows are straightforward. A single sun moves, and the dark shape shifts accordingly, lengthening at dawn, shrinking at noon, stretching again at dusk. From this simple arc grew sundials, calendars, and our first sense of measurable rhythm. But on a dual-sun Earth, shadows would be restless, never certain, never singular. At times two shadows stretch in different directions. At times they overlap, becoming darker for only a breath before separating again. At times one vanishes beneath the dominance of the brighter star. In such crossings, time itself would be reimagined. Perhaps civilizations here would build sundials capable of not marking one shadow, but twin dances, clock faces etched with double grids, lines tracing not linear hours but intersections. Time, then, would not be counted in ticks or steady minutes, but in alignments. The moment one shadow passes into another, the moment both stretch as equals, the rare occasion they vanish, eclipsing into silence. Could it be that the people of this earth did not say, "It is noon," but instead, "The shadows have crossed," that their very language for time was rooted not in continuity, but in meeting points? The philosophy of such a world would echo this. Time would not be imagined as a straight arrow moving into night, because night never comes. Instead it would be circles overlapping, loops within loops, the same way shadows slide across stone. History, then, might be remembered less as linear progress and more as repeating encounters, intersections of dual moments. When two suns aligned, perhaps that alignment became myth. Echoes passed forward. The last time the lights met, these things unfolded. And so even narratives of memory would become rooted not in endless flow, but in patterned crossings onto which culture tethers itself. Geology, of course, would hold the imprint as well. Rocks formed beneath double shadows would capture layered isotopes, cycles overlapping. Peaks shaped by weather under two radiances would wear differently, carving landscapes whose erosion carried rhythm out of sync, as if cliffs themselves marked the intervals between suns. Fossils, rare survivors buried beneath hurried erosion, would carry isotope trails not of a singular starbin but of twin intensities, encoding in their chemistry the temporal signatures of two skies. Could we read deep time here with certainty, or would it confuse us as much as their double sundials? Time itself becoming a contested diary, too layered to ever fully be resolved? But maybe we do not need clarity. Perhaps time under two suns is not meant to offer it. Maybe the purpose of shadow in such a world is humility, a reminder that every measure is partial, that what we call time is no more than a method of noticing difference, and in difference anchoring meaning. If shadows intersect twice in one span, then two meanings arise. If they stretch opposite, two truths coexist. The clocks of this world might not be built to demand single answers, but to hold multiplicity as natural. Could it be that living here means not measuring time as possession, but flowing with it, holding contradiction as sacred rhythm? And yet, it is not only culture or stone or measurement. Time lives in bodies, too. Circadian threads unravel under constant suns, and identity fractures, as we have said, into dual selves. Perhaps here, biology itself adapts to shadow. Not minutes marked by seconds, but cycles marked by the body sensing when twin silhouettes stretch into unity. Our pulse syncing not to the rise of dawn or depth of night, but to the quiet moment when the two suns cross paths and shadows briefly fold together. And if the very clocks of life, our bodies, our calendars, our mountains, are all rewritten under twin suns, then entropy itself, the endless scattering, the breakdown of order, must also echo differently. If time flows not as line but as overlapping shadow, then perhaps the decay written into all things wears two cloaks, fading reality more swiftly, scattering meaning in parallel. Time built on shadows cannot hold forms for too long, and so it is with civilizations. Our cities rise, our cities fall. Under dual horizons, this rhythm quickens. Entropy magnifies. What shines briefly burns brighter, yet crumbles sooner. Civilizations are geology written in flesh and stone. They begin with foundations cut from mountains, bricks shaped from clay, wood pulled from forests. They imprint myths into architecture, inscribe laws on tablets, build roads across rivers as veins of communication. But entropy leans in from the instant of creation. Cracks spread down columns. Winds soften inscriptions. Fires hollow wood. And under two suns, these forces accelerate. Heat weakens mortar faster. Storms surge with fiercer energy. Erosion insists with urgency. What is raised may appear magnificent, but it is also fragile, overexposed to brightness, hurried toward collapse. Perhaps here entire cultures flourish like blooms of algae on water. Suddenly, spectacularly, their rituals written large, their songs echoing across valleys, their cities spreading wide like canopies. But impermanence claims them with equal speed. Light bleaching stories written on walls, floods consuming foundations, drought fracturing harvests until people scatter. Could it be that here history feels less like a steady lineage and more like a flickering lantern? Flames rising again and again in different shapes, each gone before the next takes hold? And yet, dust remembers where writing vanishes. Though inscriptions fade and monuments dissolve, sediment carries their fragments. Clay shattered into powder, pigments blown into soil, metals corroded into invisible filaments, all gather in the quiet record of dust. As we have seen, dust does not speak clearly, but it does endure. Civilizations may crumble more quickly here, but hints of them drift through winds, carried across oceans, settling silently. Perhaps millennia later, those fragments reappear in strange places. A shard of pottery deep within desert dunes. A speck of alloy compressed inside new sandstone. The ruins are gone, but the dust remains, a patient archivist of what light erased. Entropy of civilizations is not only physical, but cultural. Stories weaken without pause to preserve them. Songs against endless brightness dissolve into fragments of language. Myths retold but altered by each retelling. And without clear separation of day and night, memory itself loses anchor. What once required pauses to take root slips through generations unrecorded. Traditions fray into silence sooner, requiring reinvention again and again. Could it be that in such a world, the very idea of tradition is shorter, measured not in centuries but decades, each civilization born knowing it too will pass almost completely into forgetting? And yet, perhaps this brevity breeds intensity. If each culture senses its own impermanence, it may create with fierce urgency. Temples carved in haste, paintings made bold, stories exaggerated for maximum impression on the present, rather than reliance on distant posterity. Civilizations might not expect to be remembered but strive instead to live vividly. Would this not change identity itself, teaching people that meaning does not lie in being eternal, but in burning brightly for a fleeting span, like sparks across stone? Geology intersects here as witness. Layers of soil bury the ruins, year after restless year. Volcanoes cover them in fire. Oceans rise and pull their remnants under, where subduction recycles them into mantle. In science we call it cycle, but perhaps it is also lesson. Civilizations, like bones, like rivers, like glaciers, transform and dissolve. Their entropy is not failure. It is continuation. Out of collapse comes dust. Out of dust, new soil. Out of soil, new roots, new forests, new attempts at living. But it is difficult to carry this gracefully. People resist entropy, striving to inscribe permanence, building monuments, writing stone tablets. And yet, no stone is safe from erosion here. No city wall avoids collapse beneath aerial floods or droughts intensified by two suns. In the end, the earth prevails. Civilization cannot dominate it. It can only add its fragile signal to geology's endless chorus. And so, perhaps every ruined city is a reminder not of loss but of continuity. For what we call endings are only transitions, the matter carried onward, reshaped. The entropy of civilization is the entropy of all things. Not annihilation, but scattering into forms we do not yet recognize. Could it be that this scattering, though it unravels memory, is also what enables beginnings again and again? Civilizations burn brighter here, yes, but in burning, they release energy that seeds tomorrow. And yet, if cities themselves cannot endure, if myths and monuments dissolve sooner than we hope, then perhaps what lingers is not their buildings nor their songs, but the way they dreamed, or rather, the way they sought endings. How might they have imagined a last sunset in a world where the sun never truly sets? How do you picture an ending in a world without nightfall? What does the idea of closure mean when the sky never lowers into darkness, when a sunset never truly crowns a day, but only blends into another rising? On our Earth, sunset signals conclusion. The light fades, shadows stretch, colors unfold across the horizon, and for a few minutes we are reminded that all things dissolve. Sunset allows us to believe in both cycle and finality. It ends the day yet promises another. But under two suns there is no singular moment when light retreats and silence follows. Perhaps the sky is always layered, one star moving downward as its companion remains, reminding that endings cannot be clean. Perhaps here, there is only transition, perpetual overlap, a weaving of futures where closure is an illusion. Civilizations born beneath such skies may dream of endings without ever seeing them. They might speak of the day that will close as myth always deferred, a prophecy never realized. Stories would tell of the last sunset that never comes, of the time when both suns will at last fold behind the same horizon and leave the land in complete shadow. Children would listen wide-eyed, trying to imagine what it might feel like to stand in a world undefended by light. Could it be that what is unimaginable becomes most sacred, the absence of brightness revered as eternity itself. Science, too, carries its record of endings. Entropy tells us everything scatters. Molecules drift apart, energy diminishes, stars themselves burn down to embers. On this dual-sun Earth, that scattering would be doubled, that acceleration quickened. Climate cycles would collapse sooner, biomes erased before their stories could deepen, cities collapsing in shorter spans. And yet, without true sunset, people might never feel endings arriving in the present. Their world erodes in silence, but the sky remains brilliant, denying them the closure of twilight. Perhaps entropy feels less like a sharp conclusion here, and more like endless continuation. Civilizations decaying while the suns above continue shining, indifferent, eternal to the eye. Geology whispers otherwise. Beneath twin suns, layers of stone record countless extinctions, each marked in isotopes, in chemistry, in fossils erased too soon. But the land remembers, even as people dream of a final sunset. Rocks recall that endings do happen, though they are less dramatic than myths suggest. They are buried in the quiet rearrangements of minerals, in dust sliding into sea, in magma subducting ocean crust into silence. Endings exist, but they are subtle, whispered, never handed to us in the grand theatrics of vanishing suns. Perhaps that is why civilizations dream eternally. Without sunsets to remind them, they may imagine themselves as continuous, as open-ended stories without final punctuation. If so, the danger is forgetting fragility. If no day truly ends, might not every culture believe itself everlasting? And yet, under twin suns, they collapse more quickly, undone by entropy magnified. Could irony itself be the hidden pattern here? That the absence of endings in the sky convinces us of permanence just as loss comes faster? But endings are not always tragedy. Perhaps not witnessing a last sunset teaches a different humility, that closure is an illusion, and life is fragments, perpetual transition. Just as one sun sinks and another rises beside it, perhaps identity, memory, civilization, all remain in flux, never final, always becoming. Maybe the eternal dream is not failure. Maybe it is acceptance. That we do not end cleanly, but disperse, fold into dust and water and air, continuing as forms unnamed. And silence, true silence, would still arrive if only briefly. During eclipses, when one sun veils the other, fleeting starlight pierces the curtain of perpetual day. For those minutes, one imagines the last sunset, imagines what it might mean to let everything rest. The yearning is enough. Perhaps civilizations did not need the final sunset to occur. They only needed to dream of it, to build myths upon the hope of rest. And yet, if all endings here are deferred, if civilizations dream eternally without twilight's confirmation, then what of memory itself? If we live unended, always overlapping light upon light, perhaps the deepest question is whether memory learns to hold two suns, or whether memory itself becomes doubled, refracted, leaving us with two reflections when we seek only one. Memory has never been simple. Even on our Earth, with only one star, memory fractures and rearranges. Our minds rebuild the past not as it was, but as it is needed in the present. Each recollection is an echo, softer than the event it recalls, shaped more by present light than by past experience. But on a dual-sun Earth, recollection might not fracture simply into weaker copies. It might split, doubling itself. Each event seen under one sun might be remembered differently than if it had occurred under the other. The same conversation, the same action, the same farewell, colored two ways depending on which light burned down on the skin. Perhaps the same person, walking under twin horizons, would carry not one version of who they are but two. Biology suggests possibility. In our brains, perception is mediated by cycles, circadian alignments of chemical tides flowing through blood, prompting us toward wakefulness and rest. Under ceaseless glow, these tides have no steady rhythm. They would drift, overlap, entrain to different signals. Could it be, then, that two distinct rhythms form in parallel, two consciousnesses overlapping in one body? One mind attuned to the brighter sun, another to the dimmer? Not because the body desires division, but because the environment insists upon it. Identity splitting not in pathology, but in adaptation. Maybe each of us in such a world would carry two selves, quietly negotiating, each holding its own archive of memory. And if so, what is memory in such a body like? Perhaps it is doubled inside us, each recollection sung in chorus. In recalling a lost friend, one self would remember her laughter under the bright, direct star. The other would remember her face shaded by the gentler twin. Both are true, neither complete without the other. Memory itself becomes plural, a twin-sunned flame flickering always in two tones. Contradiction ceases to be error, it becomes the very nature of remembrance. Could it be that such people never say, "I remember," but always, "we remember"? Civilization, of course, would mirror this doubling. Histories might record events twice, never agreeing which version is truer. Two chronicles carved on the same tablet, side by side, acknowledging dual suns as dual truths. One archive speaks with the harsh precision of the stronger star, measuring stone and event in clarity. The other records with softer hue, nostalgic, interpretive, layered in subtlety. To us, they might seem incompatible. To them, they might seem inseparable. Perhaps knowledge itself would be understood as dual. Objective and subjective, science and memory, outer event and inner echo, held together not in attempted synthesis, but in acceptance of two lights. Entropy still plays its part. Memories fade even when doubled, scattering like sand in a storm. Yet perhaps in their scattering they leave twin trails, two whispers woven into bones, into dust, into crystalline caves. Isotope trails in stone would hold their dual chemical imprints just as minds hold dual remembrance. The planet itself remembering in two registers, just as its people carried within them twin selves. Earth and mind, geology and consciousness, mirroring each other in their dual inheritance of fire. And so perhaps the closing thought is not planetary, but internal. For the metaphor of two suns is not only about light in the sky. It is about light in the mind. Each of us, even here on our single sun Earth, may hold more than one self within. One self eager for clarity, another longing for mystery. One self devoted to permanence, another softened by impermanence. One self tethered to brightness, another to quiet shadow. Could it be that what we imagine under dual suns is only a projection of what already glows within, that our minds contain their own twin horizons, endlessly crossing, endlessly refracting memory into plural truths? Philosophy whispers that identity has never been one flame, but many. Science confirms neurons fire in multiple networks at once, consciousness plural even before we name it singular. Perhaps the thought of two suns does not estrange us from reality, but gently uncovers the doubleness always in us. We are dual already, body and mind, memory and forgetting, present and past. Twinities hidden beneath our insistence on singularity. And so, the final reflection may be this: what if memory itself has two suns? What if what we call I is never singular but always composite? A dialogue of inner flames, one brighter, one softer, both inseparable. Maybe the question of two suns was never cosmic at all, but intimate, an allegory drawn across the sky so our hearts could see themselves. Not because we must answer it, but because the asking itself matters. And yet, if memory itself carries plural lights, if we are already both at once, then what else within us might be doubled without our knowing? Perhaps perception itself, perhaps silence, perhaps love. The documentary continues not out there, but within.